My name is Ryan Fletcher. I was 28 years old the night everything changed, October 12th, 2019. I remember the date because it was a Saturday, the kind that promised options, a bar that smelled like spilled whiskey, a late-night diner, or a drive along the lake to clear your head. I chose the last, which is to say, I chose the wrong sort of stillness. I tell you this sitting under a lamp that still flickers if the wind finds the right angle, and when I say true, I mean true for me. The way a night can graft itself to a person so that the memory is less a photograph than a splinter. People who haven't spent time in places like Benton Harbor picture a small lake town washed in postcard light. Boats, gulls, a ferry bell. There is that sometimes, but there's also the part of town that remembers better days and refuses to forget them. I grew up in a different corner of Michigan where the lawns were orderly and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without checking ID. Benton Harbor felt different the first time I drove through it. Rows of shuttered storefronts, porches with sagging swings, and alleys that smelled like old salt and diesel. It has edges where the city meets the lake, and those edges are where people like me go when they want to be alone and honest and raw. I'd been working odd hours at a shop in Kalamazoo and staying with an old college friend, Mark Hale, who had moved to Benton Harbor 3 years earlier. Mark was the sort of person who could find humor in a parking ticket. He also had a knack for ending up in the kind of situations other people only read about. He'd been living in a narrow second-floor apartment above a pawn shop on Whitaker Street, 2 blocks from the river. The pawn shop had a neon guitar in the window that hummed when the humidity rose. Our apartment's radiator sounded like a whale. Mark's voice still carried the same laugh it had in school, quick and surprised, and I trusted it. There were other faces that night I'll sketch in so the main picture doesn't look like one man wandering the dark. Jenna Torres was Mark's upstairs neighbor and an emergency nurse who worked the overnight shift. She kept a mug that said, Midnight Apollo, and insisted she was a realist about danger. Lucas Bryant ran the bait and tackle shop near the breakwater and could fix almost anything with duct tape and a prayer. His father had been a fisherman, and Lucas inherited the steady hands. There was also Reverend Hollis, who would later appear in the story like a wrong-turn lighthouse, tall, worn, careful with his words, and invested in stovetop tea rather than grand solutions. Before I get to the night itself, I have to tell you why I went back to Benton Harbor at all. It wasn't nostalgia, nor was it bravado. I had been trying to understand a thin, persistent tug I felt since childhood, the knowledge that small towns keep secrets, and that those secrets sometimes look like ordinary men walking ordinary streets. I wanted to see for myself the place Mark called home, to sleep in a bed that creaked the way his did, to listen for the city's softer rhythms. There's a kind of arrogance in thinking you can observe a place the way you observe a film, paused, rewound, tidy. Real life doesn't let you press pause. The week leading up to that October Saturday had been full of warnings I didn't take. A radio story about recent burglaries near the marina, an offhand mention of odd lights on the river by a bartender, and a text from Jenna telling Mark that she had the night shift and could bring coffee. I brushed them off with the same neat sentences most of us keep on hand. That's not my problem. I'll be careful. It'll be fine. Those sentences are both armor and lie. We planned a quiet night. Dinner at a place Mark liked with greasy plates and flickering booths called Rosie's. A walk down to the river to look at the lights on the water. Maybe we'd sit on the hood of his old Chevy and talk about commitments we both had been avoiding. I remember Rosie's because the jukebox was stuck between 2 rock songs and the waitress called me Han, in a way that made me feel younger and more foolish than I had a right to. Conversation was easy, the kind stitched from shared jokes and an honest hunger. We left Rosie's just after 10. The river that night had its own air, cool and peeled back, and the city's lights blurred into a smear of neon and sodium vapor. The breakwater was a place people went when the city thought it could hold its breath. Fishermen and late-night drivers and teenagers in pairs who pretended they weren't listening to anything at all. Mark wanted to walk the pier. He liked the way the water sounded when it hit the rocks below, the rhythm that was both violent and consistent. We crossed the street, our footsteps punctuating the quiet, and walked under a sky the color of a coin left out too long. At about 700 words into this, I need to tell you the shape of the night changed. That's where the main story begins, where the ordinary thread pulls and reveals the snag. Up until then, it's been place and people, the rehearsed small talk and the street lamps like tired eyes. What came after was not one startling boom or a single scream, but a sequence of small betrayals from the dark. Shadows that lasted too long, a dog that howled in a place where no dog should have been, and the way Mark's laughter stopped trying to be brave. We were near the last lamppost before the breakwater when something moved on the far side of the pier, a figure that didn't belong to any of the regulars. It was standing still like a promise, and for a second I thought it might be a person waiting for a boat. Then it shifted, and the light caught a sleeve that was too long, a face turned away, and the way people turn when they are trying not to be seen. Mark slowed. His hand found the cigarette in his pocket, and then, in the same motion, tucked it back. I felt my stomach drop into a place where memory and reason cross paths and argue. The first sound was subtle, an animal scuffing, or maybe it was just a loose piece of wood. The second sound was a whisper of movement behind us, a step laid down carefully like someone practicing a secret. I remember thinking, it's late, maybe someone's lost, maybe. Then the distance between possibility and danger collapsed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The man on the pier moved like a thing that had rehearsed patience. He stepped into the spill of the lamplight, and for the first time I could see his face. Too thin, cheeks like paper, eyes that were too dark to be called pupils. He wore a coat that had once been black and now clung to him like a rumor. There was a smell I still dream about sometimes, metal and wet cloth and something older, like cellars and cold coins. "Evening," he said. His voice was polite in a way that made my teeth ache. Mark laughed, the sound trying to be casual and failing. "You lost?" he asked, 2 steps closer. The man shook his head slowly. "Not lost. Waiting." His hands were folded in front of him as if purchased stillness could be a bargain. When he spoke, I realized the pier had gone impossibly quiet. Gulls paused on the water, a distant engine coughed and quit, and the city seemed to hold its breath as if listening in. Mark told him we were just looking at the water. The man nodded like a man who already knew the truth about us and didn't care. I could feel Mark's hand in my pocket, fingering the lighter he'd never struck. The air felt thick, like someone had pulled a curtain across the river. "Don't be nosy," the man said, and there was a softness to it that should have been comforting and wasn't. Then he did something that's burned into me because it makes no sense. He reached down and picked up a small stone from the pier, smooth and the color of spent dreams, and he held it out like a gift. Mark stepped forward, half laugh, half reach, and in that movement the world tilted. The man's hand closed around Mark's wrist like an iron trap. Not a hard grip, there was no bruise, but a seizure as if the hand itself had teeth. Mark let out a sound that wasn't quite a shout and not quite a word. It was the sound people make when the future surprises them with pain. I lunged. I don't know what I expected. Plea, explanation, reason. When I hit him, his head snapped back like a doll's, and for a breath, I thought I'd hit a man. Then the smell changed. A colder wind passed, and Mark's body slid from the man's hold as if some hidden seam in reality had been pulled apart. He stumbled, caught himself on the railing, and for a horrible instant I saw something like a second shadow behind the man, wrong and lagging, and the taste of iron in my mouth. People talk about being brave in stories as if courage is a decision. It's not. It's a noise in your chest when your limbs refuse to believe your instincts. I grabbed Mark's arm and tried to pull him away. He was shaking, his eyes glassy like a man who had been shown something no one should show another. "Let's go," he said, voice gone thin. The man smiled like one who keeps promises. "You can leave," he said. "You always can leave, but you'll carry the shore in you." His words were nonsense, and the way they landed felt like a sentence being read in a language I almost understood. I remember thinking, "Run." I remember thinking, "You idiot, stay and help." I remember too clearly the way Mark looked at me then, half ashamed, half terrified, and the sense that he had made a bargain in a different language. We moved off the pier, slow as if walking through syrup. The man stayed where he was, a silhouette against the water. When we turned, the city behind felt ordinary again. A couple arguing in a car, a dog barking too far away, the neon guitar humming. But the pier had teeth now, and every piece of wood seemed stitched with memory. Back in Mark's apartment, the radiator thumped like a failing heart. Mark sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. "He touched me," he said. The words were simple and heavy. Jenna drove over in 10 minutes flat because she had been finishing a shift, and she never ignored an odd number. She took one look at Mark, and her face folded like paper into concern. Nurses are good at seeing what matters. She pressed a flashlight into my hand and said, "We're checking the pier, now." We went back because once a place has changed in front of you, leaving it becomes an admission you'll be punished for. The pier was quieter than before, as if the man had taken the noise with him. There were marks along the wood, small scuffs, a dark smear near the last lamppost that looked for all the world like a shoe mark dragged sideways. But the worst was the water's edge. Something had been laid out along the rocks, a series of small objects arranged with deliberation. Tiny coins, a torn scrap of fabric, a child's marble, and in the center, a length of old rope knotted with care. Lucas from the bait shop arrived while we were crouched by the stones. He didn't much like things that didn't snap or bite, but he fed on practical tasks. "You see this?" he asked, hands already examining the rope. "Someone staged it. That ain't natural." He was trying to be rational. His voice trembled. The rope had a smell like the man had left a memory inside it. Salt and cold iron and a whisper that might have been someone singing very softly. I called the police. They took statements with the same mechanical patience of people who have seen stranger things than they can say out loud. They plastered the pier in yellow tape and told us to be careful. "Don't go back down there tonight," the officer said. He was young and had a crease between his eyes like someone who read too many reports. "We'll patrol it." We didn't obey. Mark couldn't sit in a room and pretend the smell of that man wasn't in his clothes. We went back at 2 in the morning with flashlights and cigarettes we didn't smoke. The city had a hum now, like a giant appliance left running. The pier stretched before us, a rib cage into the dark, and the river moved like a secret. The coins were gone, the rope was missing. Whoever had laid the offering had also come back. That's when we found the mark on the railing. A gouge in the wood, 4 lines carved close together and a small circle at the end, as if somebody had tried to etch a map into the pier. I've studied 1,000 stupid things in my life, maps, receipts, the details we think will save us, and I could not place this mark. It looked symbolic, almost like a letter from a language that records pain. My fingers shook as I traced it. The wood was still warm. "You see a pattern?" Reverend Hollis asked when he arrived, wind-battered and smelling of tea. He kept a satchel of candles in his car like a Boy Scout for the wrong kind of weather. He knelt, fingers gentle, and said, "Not superstition, Ryan. History. People here keep notes in the dark." He told us stories about the river, of men who took boats and never came back, of small shrines built on the rocks for those who vanished. His voice was steady, but the lines at the corners of his mouth deepened like trenches. We left the pier that night with a promise to stay together, to watch, to not let Mark be alone. But promises are paper. They water quickly. Later, when I checked my phone, there was a single message from an unknown number. You didn't see everything. We had thought the man on the pier was one person. We were wrong. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We went back to the pier that night like people who know the worst and hope the worst will at least be efficient. Reverend Hollis brought candles and a thermos of tea. Lucas had his boat keys and a coil of rope. Jenna carried a small first aid kit because she could not bear the idea of not having one. I held the flashlight and the message on my phone burned behind my eyes. You didn't see everything. The unknown number had not fazed me before. Now it felt like a fingertip on an old scar. We waited, 3 hunched figures and a preacher, while the river breathed cold against the rocks. The city lights smeared as if someone had smeared paint across glass. Time had a grain to it. We spoke in small sentences, checking facts we already knew. The marks, the offerings, how Mark had been touched. Mark sat with his shoulders pulled in, watching the water like it might speak back. You carry something now, Reverend Hollis said quietly, not to shame him, but to name the thing between them. He had a knack for naming. The shore keeps what it claims. He had stories to fill a book. He also had the steadiness of someone who'd buried people slowly and had learned the weight of words after that. We decided to lure the man. It was a naive plan, brave in the way children think bravery is a plot point. We left one of the coins from the small shrine in the open on the railing, and Jenna and I hid behind the fishing shack, while Mark and Lucas sat farther down the pier like bait in ill-fitting clothes. Reverend Hollis stood on the edge with his candle, a small star in the dark. Minutes passed like small drownings. Then he came, silent and patient as a tide. He walked into the lamplight and paused where the coin caught the glow. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he looked at the railing and slowly reached out to touch the carved mark. The man's fingers followed the gouge with a tenderness that made my skin pucker. Mark stood up. Something in him moved like a spring that had been wound too long, and he crossed the pier toward the man. "Why us?" he demanded, voice shaking between anger and pleading. The man turned. The face was thinner than before, but his eyes had an impossible depth. He smiled, and that smile was like the sound of money being stamped. "You found pieces," the man said. "You laid them out. You called." It should have sounded mad, and maybe it did to another ear, but to us it sounded like a truth being read from the underside. The shore takes its due. It returns what it collects. Reverend Hollis stepped forward, candle aloft. "You will not take him," he said. "You will not take him tonight." The man looked at Hollis like someone walking the length of a sentence. "Names," he said. "Names matter." Mark blurted out a name in a voice that was almost a laugh. Elias Crow. It was a name Mark had said earlier in another story, an old fisherman who had drowned decades before and whose disappearances the Reverend had once mentioned in passing. Mark said it because Hollis had spoken of history and because corners of the town keep names like talismans. The man on the pier cocked his head. "If you call the name, you give the tide its rhythm," he said. "You let it pull." He turned his attention from Mark to me in a slow, deliberate pivot. "And you," he said, "you carry the shore in you already." What happened next was not a single terrifying moment, but a collapse of small things into something that claimed the whole world. The candle sputtered and went out as if the dark itself inhaled. The water's sounds swelled into a pressure in our ears. Mark suddenly lunged, not at the man, but toward the railing, and with a movement that looked like desperation or surrender, he reached out and pressed his palm against the carved mark. For a breath that felt like a year, he smiled, a broken, relieved curve, and then he slid his hand away. He was different in the way the tide changes the shape of a beach, subtle, patient, and impossible to restore. He looked at us with eyes that held sea glass shimmer. His voice when he spoke was slightly too far away. "I remember now," he said, and the words carried 100 small voices behind them. He began to hum, an old fisherman's tune Reverend Hollis had mentioned once. Soft and ragged. It should have been a comfort, but it felt like a line being read backward. The man reached out then, not with the cruel snap of earlier, but with a gentleness that was worse. He touched Mark's forehead with 2 knuckles, and for an instant I saw not a person but an overlay. Faces in the water, a boy with a marble, a woman holding her coat tight as a ferry left without her. For a second, Mark's expression was full of grief, so old it had the clarity of newly formed ice. He fell back onto the pier, and the man turned and walked away, dissolving into the night like smoke over the river. We rushed to Mark, hands and voices jarring the moment. He was breathing, alive, but the light in his face had been dimmed. He could speak, but he would not speak about what he had seen. He told us later, between long pauses and with hands pressed to his mouth, that the man had shown him the names of people the river had taken and asked which of them he would give back. Mark said the man offered him a choice. Carry one of those remembrances himself, or let the river add another name to its tally. He chose to carry. They say bargains in stories come with a price. In our case, the price came as shadows at the lip of sleep. Mark would wake at night and trace the carved mark on the railing with his thumb. He would forget short things, events of an hour, names he'd known a lifetime. But he also woke with a clarity about certain old absences in town. Who had drowned where? What child lost what toy? He was a living ledger, and his memory was not his alone. The police never captured the man. They took our statements, checked the cameras that were uselessly grainy, and chalked the event up to an unknown vagrant or to local pranksters. The yellow tape came down, the coin that had baited him was gone the next morning, and so was a single shoe someone swore they had seen earlier. The town resumed its rhythm, but with a new heartbeat threaded through, a watchfulness, the kind people develop where light meets water. I left Benton Harbor a month later because staying felt like asking the tide to forget me. Mark stayed because he had made his trade, and because some people believe you must bear the weight you accepted. We speak sometimes in short, cautious sentences. He works in the bait shop again and sometimes hums when he thinks no one is near. He keeps his hand on the railing at the pier when he can, like a man checking to make sure a wound is still his. My phone still gets messages from numbers I don't know. Sometimes they are nothing. Spam, a wrong number. Once, months after I left, I got a single line. The shore remembers. I have kept that line like a coin in a pocket. I do not know if it is a warning or a benediction. I do know this. People talk about being brave as if bravery is an applause line. But bravery is a small, private thing. It is going back when you are afraid. It is carrying what you promised to carry. I tell the story now not to warn you away from Benton Harbor. There are worse places to be, but because some of us are marked by the places we pass through, and because towns like that like to keep their edges around certain people. I tell it so that if you ever find a carved mark on a railing or a coin laid out by the water, you will look longer and not walk away too fast. There are bargains in the dark we can't see. Sometimes the best we can do is hold each other and keep count of the names. Mark never asked me to forget. He never asked me to forgive him. He simply asked that if I ever saw the pier again, I would leave a coin on the railing for those the river might still be hungry for. I sometimes do. The coin is small and dull and disappears like all small things that matter. This is the last part of what happened to me that night. The memory lives like a tide line on my skin. I keep a small lamp on in my apartment now, and when the wind is right, I can almost hear the river breathe. I do not know if the man ever returns to the pier. I do not know if the shore will ever be satisfied. But I know that we carry what we are given, and chores of the heart are heavier than they look. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole, I'm 28 years old, and this happened on October 12th, 2018. Listen close, this is one of those small town stories that feels too local to be fully true, and yet it insists on being told. Benton Harbor sits where the river gives up to the lake, a place of cracked sidewalks, salt-streaked boats, and porch lights that swing like slow watchers after dusk. People there know the wind has opinions. It carries old conversations and the ache of things that were left undone. Ethan, he wasn't notorious, not a troublemaker or a town hero. He was a mechanic by trade, steady hands, the sort of man neighbors trusted when their cars died on the side of M139. Quiet, more comfortable with wrenches and diesel than with people. He had a laugh that came out in small shocks and a habit of walking the shoreline at night to think. Before the night that changed everything, Ethan's life was stitched with ordinary threads. His mother, June, lived in a bungalow 2 blocks from the river. She'd once worked at the paper mill before it closed and kept the curtains thin so the light could talk to the street. There was Lucas Grant, his best friend since high school, tall, quick with a grin, always down for late-night fries and bad jokes. Allison Price was the woman he'd loved and lost for reasons that were still raw. An argument about leaving Benton Harbor, about dreams that didn't line up. She'd moved away that spring and left a silence the size of a winter in his house. Benton Harbor has stories older than Ethan. On the north side, past the old municipal docks, there was a stretch people called the Flats, low, marshy land dotted with abandoned warehouses and one spindly pier that leaned like an old man at prayer. Locals told stories about the Flats. Fishermen who came back empty-handed, a radio that played a station no one had tuned into, echoes in the fog that weren't theirs. Tourists didn't come for the Flats, they came for the lake and the fish fries. But enough people whispered there was something in the reeds that watched you back, and whispering sticks to a town like moss to stone. Even rational people said the wind sounded wrong there sometimes. Ethan's nights were simple rituals. Work, until his knuckles ached, fix what was broken, get a coffee that was probably too sweet, then walk. He said the lake listened. He liked to think it kept his secrets. The night before October 12th, he closed the shop late, the fluorescent lights buzzing like tired insects. He'd been thinking about Allison, about whether the rust on his life could be sanded away, about the argument that had ended with doors and distance. Lucas had tried to talk him into a bar crawl, but Ethan needed the clarity of cold air and open water. So he walked. I should tell you about the characters who orbit a story like this, because monsters in small towns are often made of human neglect. Sheriff Tom Grady was a large man with hands that remembered when the town had more factories than fears. He believed in paperwork and neighborhood watches. Martha Whitcomb, who lived by the second bend of the river, ran a knitting circle that could knit you a sweater of gossip and pity in the same afternoon. There was also Old Man Rook, a reclusive man who kept live radios on his porch and fed pigeons in the twilight. Kids said he talked to the seagulls and the gulls answered. Each of these people had a vantage point on the night, and each would later remember details differently, what people do when truth is tangled with memory. Ethan had been warned, half joking, half serious, about walking the flats at night. "Don't go past the pier," June had said once, tugging at his jacket like she could unpull whatever threads worry had knotted. "There's shadows that don't belong to anything natural." He shrugged it off. He was a practical man. Caution felt like superstition. And yet, there was a small pocket of curiosity in him. He liked places that seemed to be whispering. He told himself that if he walked far enough, he might walk past the ache of that summer. The day itself was ordinary, a soft, late autumn sun in the afternoon, the river slow and flat like a sheet of pewter. By midnight, fog had rolled in from the lake in thick, slow waves, swallowing street lamps and stretching the night into a thing you could walk into. Ethan's boots made a measured sound along the boardwalk, and the town was mostly quiet, windows like closed eyes. He passed the bait shop that had been boarded for months, the cinder block walls tagged with old graffiti, and finally the flats, where the pier leaned like a crooked finger aimed at nowhere. It was at the edge of the pier that the air changed. The way a room feels different when someone opens a door you thought was nailed shut. There was a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the water, a low scraping like metal dragging across wood, very distant at first and then close enough to be a question. Ethan paused. He wasn't the sort of man to be spooked by noises. He'd fixed cars that coughed and died and come back to life. Still, the scraping kept time with his heartbeat, and the fog around the pier seemed to thicken as if listening too. He could have turned back then. He could have walked home, sat with a cup of instant coffee and the dull glow of the TV and pretended nothing had happened. But curiosity is a door that often opens onto a hallway, and Ethan had a key. He stepped onto the pier. For a long while, nothing dramatic happened. Just the usual small alarms, a loose board groaning, the distant caw of a gull, the breath of the river. Then, less than 700 words from the start of this telling, the main part begins. The part that left physical marks on him and sharper marks on the town. A shadow moved at the waterline, but not the kind you expect. It was taller than a man should be, as if the fog had lent it length, and it didn't have the easy right angles of a person. It paused, and when it turned, Ethan could have sworn its face was a blank slate like wet concrete. He should have run. He did not. The scraping became a voice that sounded like two things at once, someone rubbing a bottle on glass and someone clearing their throat across a room. "Ethan," it said. He answered because it used his name, wrong as that sounds for a voice that had no mouth. "Who's there?" He heard the words leave him like spit. The figure took a step closer, no feet on the boards, just a movement of darker mist, and the pier beneath him shivered. A second later, Lucas's laugh rang out from behind, bright and human, and the shadow receded like smoke. Ethan turned, heart trying to outrun its beating, and saw Lucas standing there at the dock's end, grin wide, breath puffing in the cold. He'd come to find Ethan, after all. "You look like you saw a ghost," Lucas joked, but his voice had an edge. He'd seen those shadows before in the flats. Everyone had. They only laughed to keep the town from hearing how afraid they were. They left the pier together that night, but the thing that watched them didn't go home. It waited. It followed at a distance, patient as a tide, And that patient following, that small, persistent pressure at the back of Ethan's life, was what would change everything in the nights that followed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After that night on the pier, the thing became a slow ache inside the seams of Ethan's days. It didn't strike with thunder or with a sudden cinematic horror. It came as small invasions, little things that shoved his life off its rails until the rails themselves looked wrong. First were the sounds. At odd hours, his phone would crackle with a static that sounded almost like a voice clearing its throat. He'd pick it up and hear nothing but the river's whisper wrapped in radio noise. He learned to live with the empty calls at 2 a.m, but they frayed him. Sometimes the kitchen clock stopped at 12:24, hands stuck like a secret, and no amount of winding or battery changing fixed it. Other nights, the smell of brine would flood his living room so sharp he could taste the lake, even though his apartment was 3 blocks inland and the windows were shut. Sleep became a battlefield. When he could close his eyes, the fog found him. Dreams folded into each other. First Allison, running a pale step ahead of him down a dock, then his mother's voice calling his name like a warning, then a shape in the water that rose and fell in ways that made his limbs feel detached. He woke with the imprint of fingertips on his shoulder sometimes, or with salt crusting the edges of his mouth. Lucas would come over and find him sitting on the couch at dawn, coffee long gone cold, staring at the window like it might answer. People in town noticed changes too. The bait shop owner swore his catch numbers dipped after October. Fishermen told each other to avoid nights when the fog rolled in thick. Sheriff Grady came around, polite but taut, asking about the pier and whether Ethan had seen anyone else. Ethan tried to explain, the scraping, the voice that said his name, only to find the sheriff looking at him like he was trying to sell steaks that weren't there. "There's nothing written down for this, Ethan," Grady told him. "If someone's playing pranks, we'll find out. If not, you rest. Don't get yourself worked up." But whatever watched the flats wasn't interested in paperwork. Small animals began to behave oddly. Dogs wouldn't cross certain streets at night. The pigeons Old Man Rook fed would circle and then scatter when Ethan walked by, leaving feathers behind that looked as if they had been dipped in oil. One morning, Ethan found a circle of smooth, flat stones on his front lawn, arranged like a mouth, and in the center a single, damp photograph of him, taken from behind, half buried in the dirt. He'd never seen anyone approach his house in the night, at least not anyone he could remember. There were neighbors who claimed they'd seen him at odd hours somewhere he swore he hadn't been. Time narrowed and slipped like wet rope. Lucas didn't scoff. If anything, Lucas grew into a kind of fierce worry that scared Ethan more than the fog. He suggested they go to the flats together and walk the pier again in daylight to prove there was nothing there. They did, and the pier was just a pier, old wood, algae at the pilings, a rusted cleat where boats had once tied off. But when Ethan leaned over the railing and peered at his reflection in the river, the water moved like a person inhaling, and the reflection blinked slowly, a fraction of a beat after he did. Old Man Rook was one of the few who listened without needing to convince Ethan he was mistaken. Rook's eyes were milky with age, and he had the collection of a man who saved things other people threw away. He kept scrapbooks of clippings, torn flyers for missing pets, a jar full of buttons. When Ethan went to see him, Rook didn't laugh. He made tea, poured a little for the pigeons, and then told Ethan something that had been left out of the tourist pamphlets, a story about a thing the town called the waiter. "They say it comes when the river forgets its place," Rook said, voice cracked like old paint. "Not all rivers forget, just some. It starts as small slights, boats that don't come in, nets that tear, clocks that stop, and then it wants names. It wants to be known. Folks used to leave offerings down by the flats. Not anymore. Folks stopped believing in offerings. That's how it remembers us, by how little we remember it." Ethan asked whether this was superstition. Rook shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But don't go alone at night and don't answer when it calls you by name." Heeding that advice felt simple and impossible at once. The thing had already learned his name. It spoke it the way someone might say a password. Saying nothing became its own strain. Conversations got clipped, and Ethan grew awkward in smiles. People around him started talking in softer circles, the way people do when they're trying not to fumble the truth out in front of others. Then came the night something physical changed. Ethan woke up to a sound like fingernails on sheet metal. His bedroom window was open. Fog rolled through like a slow animal. On the sill sat a small, crude lantern, coppered metal with a smear of something dark on the glass. The lantern was warm. When he touched it, he felt a tug at the base of his skull like a thread being pulled. The house smelled of river mud. He picked up the lantern and the whisper came, just at the edge of hearing, "You shouldn't have left me." He didn't sleep after that. He sat with the lantern on his kitchen table, light trembling, until dawn made the room usable again. He called Lucas, voice tight. Lucas came over in his work jacket, hands in his pockets, and took the lantern gently like a fragile vow. The light inside it dimmed when Lucas held it, as if the thing paid attention to who looked at it. Words spread. There were hushed conversations at the diner, and a rumor that someone had seen a shape on the pier, the way someone might report a lighthouse flickering differently. The sheriff increased patrols at night. At the next town meeting, people argued, should the pier be boarded up? Should there be a community watch? Some said the town needed prayer, others said it needed a police presence. The flats were an ugly truth the town preferred to ignore, the way a town ignores an empty lot until it sprouts weeds deep enough to be a forest. Ethan thought of Allison a lot in those weeks, how she'd walked away because he wouldn't leave, because the town felt like a safety blanket that choked their plans. He wondered, if he had left, whether this thing would still have claimed him. The question wasn't fair. Things like that don't play fair. And then, when he was beginning to accept a life that sounded like a long series of alerts, something happened that made him doubt the very ground under his feet. Lucas, who had been trying to be practical and brave, didn't come home one night. His truck was found at the end of the river road, idling, keys in the ignition, heat haze still rising from the hood. The tires left a single path into the mud that stopped before the flats as if whatever had taken him didn't want to be tracked. Sheriff Grady called Ethan in for questioning. Ethan sat across from the sheriff's desk and watched the town's evening light slice the blinds. He told the whole truth. The lantern, the voice, the photograph in his yard, and watched Grady take notes with a face that mingled professional concern and private disbelief. "We'll search the flats," Grady said. "We'll bring boats tomorrow. We'll find something." The words were judicial and empty like ritual. That night, Ethan dreamed he was walking on glass. Each step broke a light, and in the cracks he saw Lucas's face, and then a dark shape swallowing everything else. He woke with his arms pinned to his sides, as if invisible hands had been there. On his left forearm was a bruise shaped like a crescent moon. It was new and looked burned into him. He didn't know whether to be more afraid of what had been done or what was happening to his memory. The town was changing, or perhaps it always had been, and they were only now becoming honest with it. People who'd once shrugged became watchful. Old stories resurfaced, smoother and more dangerous than before. The flats took on the quality of a waiting thing, patient, methodical, like the tide. Ethan began to keep the lantern under his bed, though he knew foolish objects don't guard you from whatever wants your name. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They found Lucas's jacket the next morning, half buried in the mud where the road met the flats. A blue, threadbare thing caught on a broken fence post, zipper down as if he'd been ripped out of it. Ethan went to see it alone at first, because men do that in small towns. They carry grief like a private tool. He stood where the truck's tire marks ended and listened. The river breathed like a giant with a cold. There were no footprints leading away from the jacket. No drag marks, nothing to prove a human hand had taken him. The sheriff called it baffling. The town called it tragic. Ethan called it a failure of explanation he couldn't live with. They searched. Boats combed the shoreline while the town watched from the roadside, like mourners pressed to the edge of a funeral. Sheriff Grady organized teams, volunteers, even a dive squad from a neighboring county. But the river kept its secrets. They found only twigs, a dog collar, beer cans, and once a single cigarette butt someone swore wasn't any brand they'd seen around town. The deeper they went, the less sense things made. Ethan began to change. If grief was a weight, his felt like a living thing, Stiff, demanding, territorial. He woke sweating, eyes raw. He couldn't shake the feeling that something watched from just beyond the world of lamps and porches. People tried to be kind in practical ways, brought casseroles like offered to sit up with him for a night. But kindness began to fray. Conversations stalled. Neighbors didn't know what to do with a man who smelled of river mud and watched the fog like it might answer. Old Man Rook came by one afternoon with a paper bag of things he'd found in his pigeon feeding. Metal trinkets, a child's marble, a rusted key. If you want to bargain with a thing, Rook said, eyes milky and steady, you don't do it with anger. You do it with something it can hold. It remembers objects. It likes stories attached to them. He handed Ethan a flat, dull button, one from his jar of saved things. It'll keep you from being forgotten for a little while. Whether it was superstition or simple comfort, Ethan tied the button to the inside of his jacket. It felt foolish and private, like prayer whispered under the breath. He started walking the edges of the flats in daylight, tracing the river line with his feet and collecting small, ordinary things that might be offerings. A chipped mug, a child's lost mitten. He left them at random places in the reeds, as if by scattering small tokens he might confuse whatever had taken Lucas and buy them both some room to breathe. But offerings don't always work the way people hope. One night he left a photograph of Lucas smiling at a summer barbecue, and by morning the photograph lay face down, soggy and torn. The mitten he had left the week before came back to his porch in the center of a ring of blackened stones. It was as if the flats spat things back when it was bored. Rumors bloomed. Some said they'd seen a boat on the mist with no one in it. Others swore figures walked the pier at dawn, wearing faces like masks. The knitting circle at Martha Whitcomb's became a small tribunal. They stitched and speculated and decided Ethan was half broken, and yet they brought him soup nonetheless. In a town like Benton Harbor, fear pulls people toward each other like tides pull sand. There was a night. Fog so thick, Ethan couldn't see the porch light across from his own house, when he heard Lucas's voice call from somewhere wet and far. It wasn't a clear call. It was like the radio static that had haunted his phone since the pier. "Ethan," it said, and the breath left him. The voice sounded too close and too wrong. He went out into the night, lantern in hand, and old Rook's button hot against his ribs. He didn't go straight to the pier. He walked the river road, the way Lucas used to before his truck, before the vanished trail. Along the way, lights in houses blinked on and off like somebody trying to answer a complicated question. Dogs barked far away and then stopped. Ethan followed the sound he hoped was his friend's voice, though he couldn't be sure whether he wanted to find Lucas alive or to find some explanation that would let him bury the worry. At the flats, the air felt like a living thing that had just learned motion. The reeds whispered with 1,000 small fingers. Ethan saw shapes, fishermen's lanterns, or the memory of lanterns, and then there was a movement at the pier. Something tall and too smooth for human joints, like smoke coalesced into the shape of a person. Stepped off the pier without making a splash. Ethan's feet refused for a heartbeat. Then he ran. He ran because Lucas's laughter had once been the sound that made him understand there were still things worth living for. He ran because running felt like an act of defiance against the slow, collected dread that had been building in the town like calcified salt. He reached the end of the pier and saw Lucas, or something wearing Lucas's silhouette, standing at the boundary where water and fog blurred. Lucas's head was turned in a way he shouldn't be able to hold, and his shadow moved like oil. "Ethan," the shape said, and this time it wasn't the voice blown through a radio. It was as if the river itself had decided to speak. "Why did you leave me?" Ethan didn't have an answer at once. The world was a narrow thing, and the question fit like a blade. He wanted to scream all the reasons, the arguments, the stubbornness, the fear of leaving the town that had been his bones. But words dried up, and what came out was simpler. "I'm here now." The thing laughed then, a sound like waves on tin. It reached for him, not with hands, but with a pressure that filled the pier's boards. Ethan felt his boots pull at the wood as if someone tried to drag him sideways into the river's mouth. He gripped the cleat with both hands, knuckles white, and pulled himself back from the edge. The button Rook had given him dug cold into his palm, tiny and real. and for a moment it felt like a hinge between two worlds. "Bring it," the thing in Lucas's shape whispered. "Bring what you owe." Ethan realized in a cold flash that this wasn't just about Lucas. The flats wanted a ledger, and it was writing its list in townspeople's names. Offerings, memories, things had weight here. He had thought of offerings as distractions, little bribes. Now he understood they might be the price the river demanded when it felt ignored. He did something desperate. He shouted Lucas's real name, one he'd used only in laughter in the summer, the name that made his friend roll his eyes, and then he dove. The water took him like a door shutting. It wasn't cold at first, it was warm as bone. Time lost its edges. He felt himself falling and not falling. Ye go. Heard the river speaking in syllables that felt older than the town. He felt a hand. No. He felt pressure around his ankle, pulling, and he kicked, and then something passed over him like a curtain, and then he was back on the pier, coughing up river water, Lucas's face a breath away and staring wide with a look that wasn't simply fear. "Help me," Lucas said, and Ethan tried to remember whether the voice was Lucas's voice or the river's imitation. They stumbled back along the pier together, each step leaving a smear of cold on the boards. Behind them, the flats breathed like a beast settling down. Something watched from the waterline, patient and satisfied. Ethan thought the worst was over. He thought the tide had yielded one of its prizes. He didn't yet know the accounting. When they reached land, the town's porch lights were a faint string, comfortable, human. People emerged, neighbors, Sheriff Grady, Old Man Rook with his pigeons in a slow orbit. Lucas was shaking and very much himself in ways that made Ethan want to collapse into his ribs. But there was a mark on Lucas's throat, a thin, pale line like a seam, and in his mouth when he spoke, there was a taste of salt and metal. They took Lucas to the clinic. The doctor checked him and found nothing tangible to explain the way Lucas flinched at sunlight or why his eyes seemed to remember long corridors of water. The mark on his throat faded in a day, but the way he moved became small and careful, as if he kept checking for strings nobody else could see. That night, Ethan sat on his porch and watched the river like a man watching a wanted poster. He washed with river soap until his skin smelled of mud and dawn. He thought he had done something brave. He thought maybe bravery could be a currency worth spending. He was wrong. What he didn't yet realize was that the flats had an appetite for more than bodies. They wanted stories, names, and the easy forgetting of townsfolk. And when a river decides to collect, it is patient and clever. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The morning after Lucas nearly drowned, the town felt like something held its breath. People moved slow, as if any sudden motion might wake the thing that had been fed. For a week, nothing else happened. No disappearing headlights, no strange photographs left in doorways, but the quiet had the quality of a room before a storm. It was heavy and charged. Ethan thought maybe that was the bargaining. The flats took a while to tally. But town memory is long in small places, and stories are a kind of ledger. Old Man Rook dug out a yellowing newspaper from his stacks and smoothed it on his kitchen table with fingers that had fed pigeons for decades. The headline was faded, but the edges told what the town had tried to forget. A string of disappearances in the 50s, then again in the 70s, each clustered around the flats and each followed by a long season of quiet. People moved away, factories closed, and the stories cooled into superstition. They tried to fix it once, Rook said. A council, offerings, a man who read names from a book. They tied a bell to the pier and set a list of names. It worked for a while, but people forgot the list. They forgot to keep it, so it began again. Ethan listened and felt something like a duty settle on his shoulders. If this thing fed on being forgotten, then remembering might be a weapon. He began to collect names. He wrote them on scraps of paper. Lucas Grant, Miriam Lowe, the bait shop owner's grandmother who used to fish at dawn, Sheriff Tom Grady's grandfather, Old Man Rook's wife, names that belonged to people and stories. He read them aloud to the river sometimes like a litany, as if making a record could keep the flats from reaching into the town. Word spread quietly of what Ethan was doing. Some called him obsessed. Others came at dusk with faded photographs and old keepsakes. The knitting circle became a sort of archive. Martha Whitcomb organized names and photographs into a loose book. People came in ones and twos, then in groups, neighbors with things their grandparents had kept, teenagers with Polaroids, fishermen with logbooks. They pinned their offerings to the pier: buttons, coins, a child's toy car with paint peeling, a pocket watch that no longer ticked. The pier slowly filled with small, ordinary objects that were heavy with memory. Sheriff Grady, whose skepticism had always been practical, surprised Ethan by saying little and doing more. He organized a watch not of men with guns, but of people with names. They walked the flats at dawn, calling out the names from the book, stakes of memory hammered into the wet ground. The town's weekly meeting turned into a ritual by degrees. No prayers, no sermons, simply people reading the names of those who had lived here. Harmless, living names, so the river would find the town full of accounts. There were arguments. Some said the town was indulging superstition and that by concentrating on it, they might make it worse. Others argued that remembering was the only humane thing left to do. The pier's ledger grew clumsy but genuine. Ethan, who had always been better with wrenches than words, found himself reading aloud at night by lantern light, and his voice, rough at first, steadied. One night, months after Lucas's jacket was found, the fog rolled in thicker than any before. The pier shuddered underfoot like a sleeping animal rearranging itself. The group gathered: Old Man Rook, Martha, Sheriff Grady, June, Ethan's mother, and a dozen others who had learned names like prayers. Lucas stood there too, his hands shaking, a scar under his shirt like a thin map. He had never been the same. None of them were. But he wanted to be present. Maybe, he said, because being present was the simplest defiance. They read the names. They read them twice, 3 times, slow and deliberate, each syllable an anchor. When they read aloud the name of a man who had disappeared in 1954, a gull dropped from the sky and caught a scrap of fishing line in its beak like a punctuation mark. When they read Miriam Lowe's name, the air tasted briefly of coffee and rope, 2 things she'd once loved. The objects on the pier warmed as if touched by a hand. The fog pared back, the way a curtain edges away when someone pulls the cord. At the edge of the pier, where the water normally blurred into sky, something moved, not with malice at first, but with the slow curiosity of something acknowledging it had been noticed. The shape rose like a shadow, accepting an invitation. This time, Ethan did not stand alone. He said Lucas's name, then his mother's, then the names of people the town had all but forgotten, and each time he felt a small give in the world, like a joint unclenching. "It wants names," Old Man Rook murmured. "It wants to be known so it can stop taking." There was no cinematic battle, no stabs of lightning or holy water. The flats responded like a creature finding its feet after one remembers its name. The fog receded a strip at a time. Tides shift and so do bargains. The river did not suddenly become friendly, but the thing at the river's edge slowed. It settled into a place like a beast that had been put on a leash. People clapped each other on the back that night like soldiers who'd come through a hard winter. They drank coffee until dawn and told stories of the names they'd read. There were no guarantees. Lucas's gaze was often distant. Sometimes at night he'd wake and twine his fingers as if wrapping them around an urge to go back out to water. The town's ledger required maintenance. You couldn't simply read names once and think the account closed. Memory needs tending, like a garden that reseedings keep alive. Ethan made a choice that surprised even himself. He sold his small mechanic shop and used the money to build something no one else had asked for: a simple plaque and a small shrine by the river where people could leave names and photos and tokens. It was not a cure. It was a promise. Each year, on the anniversary of Lucas's disappearance, October 12th, the town gathered at the shrine and read names. New names were added: births, deaths, the people who moved through Benton Harbor and left marks. The ritual became less about fear and more about memory. Years later, when people asked Ethan why he stayed, why he built a shrine in a place other towns saw as ugly, he would say, because someone had to remember. Because forgetting was the cheap thing the flats fed on. He would tell them how small offerings and stubborn remembering did not erase what had been taken, but they made room for the living to keep living. He would say the river is still the river, capable of both kindness and cruelty, but a town that remembers is harder to swallow. Lucas married years later in a small kitchen with chipped paint and a pitcher of lemonade. He still flinched at certain nights. There were stretches when he didn't talk about the river, But he came to the readings and to the shrine and sometimes left a small token, a photograph or a tin toy, careful and exact like a man tending a wound. Ethan never called the story tidy. People in Benton Harbor knew how to carry their scars without letting them define each day. The flats remained, a place people respected and walked around if they had to. But the pier, once a forgotten finger pointing to nowhere, became a place where names were said aloud. The creature that had lived in the water's edge was not destroyed. Creatures like that are patient, but it was accounted for. It had to listen now to all the voices it had once been fed on. At night, when the wind comes off the lake and the fog curls gentle as breath, Ethan walks to the shrine. He stands a while and touches the cool metal plaque, tracing the names with a thumb. There are years when the river is quiet and years when it presses at the town like an old debt. Memory needs tending, he knows, so he tends it. This story is one of many small, stubborn acts that make a town less easy to lose. It is true, or true enough, because in the telling people remember differently, and memory, unfettered, is sometimes the only thing that keeps monsters from finishing the work they started. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Ward, I'm 34 years old, and what I'm about to tell you began on October 3rd, 2019. A night that started like any other, and ended with me questioning everything I thought I knew about the town I grew up in. I didn't plan to go back to Benton Harbor that fall. Life in Chicago had a comfortable hum. A design job, a small apartment with plants I mostly killed, and a podcast I did as a hobby about overlooked places and the people who haunt them. But my phone kept buzzing with messages about an old friend, Marcus Hale, the kind of person who had been a constant in my childhood summers, fishing by the river, daring me to climb the tallest pier, laughing until his face went red. Marcus was missing. Not the social media posting, "I'm busy" kind of missing, but the kind of vanishing that leaves a cold ring on the phone where his name used to vibrate. I figured I would go down for a weekend, check in with his sister, meet a cop or two, walk the Riverwalk, and return to the city with a story for the podcast. It wasn't my first time back in Benton Harbor. We all left for a while, jobs, school, relationships, but the town kept its shape. The same grid of streets, the same boarded storefronts, with paint peeling in a way that made the whole place look tired and ornery. People still talked about the old steel plant that closed decades ago, and about how the seasons felt heavier there, as if the wind could hold a grudge. On the drive down, I thought about Marcus as he used to be. Messy, brilliant, reckless with loyalty. He'd moved back a few years earlier after his father died, taken a job at the marina, and kept the old family boat despite its damp smell and the way it sagged like an old dog. He'd been steady for a while. Then his posts on a certain local forum got strange. Late-night rants about voices under the bridge and photos of things he swore weren't man-made. Friends joked, others were worried. When his sister Beth called me the week before I left and her voice cracked halfway through, joking stopped. Benton Harbor had changed too, in ways both obvious and quietly corrosive. A new coffee shop had opened where the hardware store used to be, with succulents in the window and a barista who knew all the regulars by name. The river, broad and dark, still cut the town in two, and the mills that once hissed and groaned were rust skeletons now, their windows like blind eyes. There was an emptiness behind the facades like a held breath, a sense of waiting that never quite felt right. I rented a room above a bakery on the main street. The owner, Ruth, had a voice like a radio announcer from an old show, warm but with a steel thread when she talked about kids getting in trouble. She told me where the kids hung out, where Marcus had fixed his boat, and where he liked to drink coffee and argue about obscure bands. She didn't want to say too much about the bridge. "You don't want to go poking around there at night," she told me. And then, softer, "Not if you're going to believe what you hear." There were other characters in town who would later fold into the story like layers of old wallpaper. Jonah Blake, who ran the bait shop and had known Marcus since they were boys. Jonah had a laugh that started in his chest and spilled out. He talked in small, sharp sentences and kept up the pocket knife he played with when thinking. Lillian Crow, the librarian, had a way of fixing you with a look and then handing over the precise book you didn't realize you needed. She kept a scrapbook of local news clippings in her purse, like talismans. An older cop named Officer Harris had the slow patience of someone who'd seen too many tragedies to be surprised by anything anymore, but his eyes sharpened when he mentioned the river at night. Before I found Marcus's absence, I wandered the places we'd all known as kids, testing my memory against the new maps of the town. The pier where we dared each other to jump still jutted into the water, and the paint on the railing had been scrawled with initials and hearts, layered on by decades of hands. At dusk, the river turned an almost perfect black, swallowing the light like a secret. The bridges arched over it like vertebrae, functional and a little arrogant, as if the town was trying to hold itself together against gravity. On my second day in town, I met Beth at a diner with yellowed booths and a jukebox that never quite chose the right song. She looked like Marcus, but filtered through time and worry. Same tilt of the chin, but paler, the laugh lines replaced by maps of sleepless nights. She told me that Marcus had been exploring the old canal district, taking pictures, saying there was something dwelling in the hollows beneath the old structures. She didn't use the word supernatural. She used phrases that made you feel small, like it doesn't like to be seen and it moves with the water. I asked about the forum posts, about the photos. She passed me Marcus's phone. The images were grainy, a smear on the river at midnight that looked like a shadow with an edge, a smear complicated by motion or maybe by the camera's limits. There were voice memos too, fragmented, garbled breathing, a low whimper that might have been wind. But there was one message with Marcus's voice, clear as a bell, whispering, "If I'm not back by dawn, look where the river forgets itself." That line lodged in my head. I told him to stop, Beth said, rubbing her palms together like it was a habit she couldn't quit. I told him not to poke where folks bury things. It was an odd phrase, and I later learned it had a local meaning, referring to places where the river's current pulled and kept things hidden. Sunken foundations, forgotten channels, and the deep green eddies where the water looked like moving bruises. On my third night, I crossed the old river bridge alone after midnight, the town behind me asleep, the moon a thin coin. The bridge hummed with the wind and my footsteps. Below, the water moved with a dull, patient energy, reflecting a town that had learned to keep its secrets. Halfway across, a figure stood at the railing, not quite human in the way it turned its head. For a breath, I thought it was Jonah out for a smoke or a homeless man wrapped in a thrift store coat. But when I stepped closer, the figure dissolved into a mist that smelled faintly of iron and old paint. It moved like the surface of the river had been given shape. I wasn't there for the dramatic unmasking, though. That would come later. That night, standing on the bridge, I felt the kind of smallness you get when you realize you've missed the important part of a story. The townspeople said certain places had a kindness and a cruelty to them, and for the first time I felt both. The mercy was in the ordinary, a diner opening at 6, Jonah leaving a box of bait for his customers. The cruelty was in the way the ordinary could be rent by something older and very patient. When the fog rolled in, it wasn't the polite, cottony fog of postcards. It pressed against the bridge rails, clung to my jacket, and filled my ears with an odd, muffled hush. I pulled out my recorder, and for the first time since I arrived, I turned it on. The device caught a low thrum under the water, not the sound of engines or the town's distant hum, but a slow, rhythmic pulse like a giant sleeping heart. I wrote it down, shaking, because the rational part of me tried to label it as natural, tide, current, structural vibration. But the part of me that remembers Marcus's last coherent message felt the hairs on my arms stand up. This is where the main story begins, the moment when the town's hush broke and something decided it had been noticed. I stepped off the bridge, recorder in hand, drawn by a path that should have led nowhere and yet bent like a suggestion into the black. There were footprints in the mud, not many and not fresh, but shaped in a way that was known to anyone who had walked the riverbanks as a kid. Long, narrow prints, as if someone had been wearing boots meant for water but not for much else. The air tasted like pennies. I followed the trail toward the old canal, where concrete had softened into moss and the skeletons of pilings jutted from the water like broken teeth. The light here was wrong. Not less, exactly, but skewed, as if the world had tilted a few degrees and could not find its balance. That olfactory edge of iron turned sharper, and in the gap between two collapsed beams, I saw the first thing that would change everything. A scrap of fabric snagged on a nail, the frayed edge stained and unmistakable. It was part of Marcus's jacket. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The scrap of Marcus's jacket felt wrong in my hands. Too small, too recent, as if it had been torn in a hurry. I called Jonah first. He smelled of diesel and the bait shop. He answered on the third ring with a voice that went flat when I told him what I'd found. "Don't touch anything," he said. "Get back to town. Let me come look." We met at first light behind the marina where the boats leaned like tired animals. Jonah's face was set in a way I didn't like. He kept glancing at the water as if it had turned its back on him. We showed Beth the scrap, and she cried a little. This time not from the ache of loss, but from the rawness of being right. Officer Harris came by with his notebook and a pair of latex gloves that made him seem like a man who wanted the world to behave by rules he could understand. "We'll grit it," he said. "Start up the river, check the banks, call in divers if we have to." He didn't sound convinced the river would cooperate, but the river had already been at work. Over the next 24 hours, the town offered small, sharp pieces of its history. An old shoe nabbed in the reeds, a rusted wristwatch with a face frozen at 1144, and a series of footprints that led from the bank into the water and then simply stopped as if swallowed. Lillian Crow came to the marina with a stack of newspapers she'd clipped over the years. She spread them out on Jonah's counter and pointed to headlines about other disappearances. Not all in Benton Harbor, but enough to make a pattern. "They call it the forgetting," she said. "Places where the river keeps things. People, too." One of Marcus's last photos from his phone had more to it than a smear. Jonah stayed late into the afternoon, blowing it up on his laptop until the pixels became landscapes of shadow. There, under a broken bridge support, was a darker patch. Not a shadow, but a negative space with edges that looked deliberate, like a mouth carved into the earth. Around it, the water made small circling eddies that weren't natural, that moved with a rhythm I could feel in my chest. When I played the voice memo Marcus had sent, the sound I remembered, his whisper, had a second layer beneath it, a low harmonic tone like a tuning fork struck underwater. "You hear that?" Jonah asked. He kept touching his neck as if the sound might be lodged there. We organized a search that evening. Officer Harris called in a pair of volunteers who knew the river well, men who had spent decades on the water and trusted their instincts more than instruments. They tossed lines, scanned the banks with flashlights that looked almost apologetic in the fog. The fog that night came in thick and immediate, swallowing the light and making the town feel like a ship lit from inside. Voices sounded far away, jumbling into one another. At the old canal head where Marcus had been photographing the collapsed warehouses, we found something that stopped everyone mid-sentence. Nails had been arranged in a circle on a wooden beam, rusted but recently hammered in. In the center lay an arrangement of river stones, stacked into a tiny cairn, and beneath it, pressed into the mud, the shallow impression of a hand. "Not natural," said one of the volunteers, a man named Gus with water-hardened knuckles. "Someone put that there." "Who would do that?" I asked, but the question scraped hollow. That night, I sat with Marcus's phone on the table and played every recording. Between the breaths and wind, there were moments that felt like messages when slowed down, syllables out of phase, a voice that said my name when played at 2/3 speed. I told myself it was wishful thinking. I told myself 1,000 rational things. But then late, I found a file I hadn't noticed, an unlabeled video. I hit play. At first, it was nothing but darkness. Then the camera tilted, showing the lip of a dock, a pair of boots, and a hand that reached down. The audio was a distant, wet scraping, and then, unmistakably, Marcus saying, "Ethan, where are you?" It was the same tone he'd used when he wanted help with a jammed motor, light and cynical. But beneath it, there was another sound, the pulse I'd heard on the bridge, louder now, rhythmic and patient. The video jittered. In the very last frames, the camera swung down to the water and captured a face just under the surface, not clear, not whole, but with an outline that could have been Marcus's cheekbone. The image blurred. The file ended. I don't know why I considered going in. Perhaps grief narrows you in a way that feels like purpose. Perhaps the storyteller in me believed there would be answers if I just put myself in the right place. Jonah insisted on coming. He said he wouldn't leave me alone on this. Officer Harris said no, then, after a long silence, handed us a pair of life jackets. "You're going to be careful," he said. "And if anything goes sideways, you get back in that boat and you get to shore. Understood?" We took one of Marcus's boats out at dusk. The engine coughed and then found a rhythm, a sound that did not comfort me. The town receded, the lights narrow, until all we had was the boat's wake and the dense hush of the river. Jonah rowed us into the mouth of the canal Marcus had been mapping. The boat scraped over submerged timbers. The GPS on my phone showed the waterway bending into a tight, dark throat. The fog closed behind us like a door. Our headlights picked out shapes, pilings, a collapsed roof, the suggestion of a doorway half submerged. Jonah cut the engine to listen. For a long moment there was nothing but the small splashing of night insects and the hum of the boat. Then, almost inaudible at first, the low pulse started. Not mechanical now, but organic, as if the river had a diaphragm and was breathing through it. "Turn it off," I whispered. The recorder in my pocket felt heavy. I reached for it, and for a second, as my hand brushed the phone, I heard my own name and Marcus's voice coming from the little speaker. Not a looped clip, not something I had cued. It was immediate and close. "Ethan." Jonah swore and fumbled for the phone. The moment he picked it up, the current changed. The boat lurched, as if something large had rubbed past the hull. The water at our stern rose in a tiny, impossible swirl, and from it came a sound like fabric tearing. Jonah's flashlight caught a flash of color, the same muddy green of the scrap of jacket, and a hand, pale and glistening, slipped up over the side of the boat. It didn't grip. It lingered like a question. "Marcus?" I said, my voice small. The hand twitched. The fog condensed around us in a way that muffled sound, and then a figure surfaced a few feet off the bow, his face pulling itself up from the water with a slowness that belonged in nightmares. For a breath, I thought it was Marcus because of the jawline and the way the eyes opened and focused on me. But there was dirt under the skin, a sediment that moved like living ink. The face turned and smiled, and it was not Marcus's smile, but a mimicry of it. The figure raised a finger and tapped the water twice, a small, deliberate signal, and then the water around it began to fold like pages of a book closing. "Row!" Jonah shouted. He did. The oars bit the water with desperate force. The figure's laughter, not human, not quite sound, I recognized, chased us into the narrow mouth of the canal. The pulse on the recorder escalated into something that felt like a command. Jonah's shoulder hit the rail. I could smell river rot and something sweeter under it. Behind us, the fog thickened into a wall, and in that wall I thought I heard Marcus whispering the single phrase that had set me here in the first place. "Look where the river forgets itself." We didn't stop until the town's lights blinked back at us across the water. But the image of that face, and the way the hand had trembled, like someone remembering how to hold a thing, hung in me like a bruise. Back ashore, Jonah swore he saw a dark shape slip beneath the surface, and then, impossibly, a ripple that spelled out a name in the circles it made. I went home and listened to the recorder until dawn. Between the pulses and the static, there was a new sound, a voice, layered and thin, calling, "Ethan. Do you remember when you used to dare me?" It ended with a laugh like wind through a broken mast. I turned the device off and sat in the dark, feeling watched by a room I knew too well. Something in the town had noticed us noticing. The river, Jonah said later in a voice that didn't try to be brave, had always been a place of transactions. Deals struck quietly, memories tossed. Now it was answering back. I didn't know if it would keep answering. I only knew I couldn't stop. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After that night on the water, the town felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because there were fewer places to hide from what had watched us. Larger because every ordinary thing now had a face pressed to its back, listening. I couldn't sleep. I walked the riverbanks until my shoes went soggy, replaying the video and the way the hand had trembled when it touched the boat. Marcus's absence had become a particular kind of weight. I could feel it in the tilt of my head, the way I avoided reflections. People started treating me like a live wire. Some offered help, others crossed the street. Ruth at the bakery slid a coffee across the counter and left a plate of biscuits with a note in scrawl, "Don't go alone." Lillian brought me a stack of clippings from the library one afternoon, the paper smell strong enough to make the whole room spin. She had a way of arranging things so they read like confessions, columns from decades apart that echoed each other. There were disappearances in 1951, 1973, 1998, all along the same stretch of river, always where the water bent and hid its teeth. "They called it the forgetting," Lillian said, smoothing her cardigan with careful fingers. "People used to believe rivers collected what they owed. Things, names, promises." She tapped a headline from 1951. A boy had vanished near an old mill. They found his hat months later on a piling. "Sometimes something else gets attached to the place," she added, "a memory that doesn't go gentle." Officer Harris grew quieter. At first, he tried to keep everything official. Reports, chains of custody, statements. But the items we found didn't like being cataloged. A watch would appear clean on a dock and then be gone the next morning. Boots would sink where teams had checked the mud. The volunteers began refusing to search after dark. "There's a pattern," Harris said one evening, voice low enough to be mistaken for the radio hum at the station. "Tides out, places show themselves. Tides in, things walk away." He looked at me like he was pleading for something he could not say. Those nights, the river haunted my dreams. I saw faces under glass, mouths moving but soundless. I woke tasting salt and pennies. Once I dreamed Marcus laughing, but the laugh turned into the creak of an old boat and then into the low, patient pulse I felt in my chest during the day. When I woke, my hands were cramped as if I'd been rowing. Jonah was a good anchor. He had a steadiness that came from hanging on to what he loved. He'd grown more protective, like a brother living with the guilt of not being able to stop an accident. But he had his own theory. "It's like a hunger," he said one afternoon while we sat on a dock and watched the water, "but not for bodies, for being remembered wrong." He tapped the planks with a finger. "It likes names said backward, thinking you're calling someone home when you're really calling an answer." Between Lillian's clippings and Jonah's gut, we started to stitch a map of the river's moods. There were eddies that returned things, a spool of twine one day, a child's shoe the next. There were dark hollows where sonar flattened like burned paper. The volunteers who had once joked about ghosts now spoke of signs and marks. One evening, Gus, the volunteer with the water-hardened knuckles, found a symbol carved into a piling, a circle with 3 short lines arsing inward like a broken crown. It was old, older than rust, but the cuts were clean, as if something had recently used the mark again. We set up a watch, not because we thought we could fight the river, that would be arrogance, but because sitting idly felt worse than risking being wrong. Jonah and I took a shift one night along the canal banks where Marcus had last walked. We brought lights, rope, and one of those old underwater lamps that threw a cone of yellow into the dark. Gus covered the other side. Lillian stayed behind with Beth, who had grown quieter and more brittle with each day. It started slow, the typical sounds, frogs, a far-off dog, a boat's muffled engine. Then the pulse, subtle at first, like someone tapping a rhythm through the boards. I had the recorder on my lap, its red light a tiny, stubborn eye. Jonah kept one hand on the oar, one leg braced on the dock. The fog rolled in like a soft thief. I heard a child's humming, tinny and fragmentary, threading through the pulse. I realized it was a tune Marcus used to sing when he was nervous, a ridiculous, made-up chorus from our childhood. My throat closed. "Marcus?" I said before I could stop myself, and the sound of my name answered, but not in Marcus's voice. It was layered, like a record played with a slow tremor. Something moved in the water, not a ripple, but a folding, as if the surface itself had muscle. The lamp's beam caught on something that reflected like teeth. For a terrifying second, I thought it was a mouth. Then, as if answered by a script only the river knew, a child's hand broke the water and clutched a wet, mud-smeared toy boat. The boat was tiny, its paint flaked to reveal a name stamped faintly beneath the mud. E. Ward. My stomach turned. "You seeing this?" Jonah whispered, and for once his voice had no bravado in it. He leaned forward, the lamp's light trembling in his hands. The hand let go and retreated. The toy bobbed, and then it chugged toward us on its own small wake, a ridiculous, impossible thing. I fished it out, glove-covered fingers trembling. The paint was flaking, but the initials were clear. It wasn't Marcus's, not really. It was my name stamped on a cheap toy we'd lost in the river when we were 7, a relic of the kind of dare we used to make each other take. I hadn't thought about that toy in 27 years. I hadn't thought about the day we dropped it into a slow eddy and laughed like everything would always be small and stupid and safe. The toy smelled like the river and something older. When I held it, a pressure rose behind my eyes and images slid past, a child's hand, a man in a hat lowering a lantern, water rising like a wall. It felt like memory, and like suggestion both, as if the river dipped into my past and rearranged it slightly, not to deceive outright, but to fold me into its story. Gus swore under his breath and tapped the piling where the carved symbol was. "It's feeding off things that tie folks here," he said. "Names, habits, old promises." He looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen. "It called you. It called you by what it knew you'd remember." I don't think I understood the full scope of that until later, but in that moment, the toy boat was a key. Not to a lock we could open, but to a door we had never known existed. The river wanted us to remember, but only in a way it could understand and own. We left the toy with Lillian, and she wrapped it in tissue paper like a relic. "Keep this safe," she said. "Don't let it be the only thing you give it." Her fingers were steady. Rivers keep what you trade them, and sometimes they return what they want to make sure you keep trading. That night, sleepless and raw, I went back to the video Marcus had recorded. In the jerky frames before the face surfaced, I noticed something new. A figure at the lip of the dock with a coat like Jonah's, watching the water with the patience of a person who waits for tides to speak. The figure lifted a hand and made that 3-line gesture, the broken crown. For a second, the camera caught the profile and I thought I saw my father's jawline. Then it blurred. I realized how deep this was. It wasn't simply about Marcus. The river could touch the memories people didn't know they'd hidden. And when it did, it rearranged them into pages of its own book. It could take a toy and make it mine, and then use it to call me by a name I had once cherished. We decided to try to talk back. Not with words, that would be childlike, but with presence. We would take objects that belonged to others who had vanished and bring them to the places the river had shown us, because if the water wanted trade, perhaps we could bargain in a language it understood. It was foolish and dangerous, and 1,000 parts of me wanted to stop. But grief sharpens choices into edges, and I was willing to cut myself in order to know what lay beneath. We planned the next night carefully. Ropes, 2 boats, lights, and a line of volunteers who would stand in case someone needed pulling back. We brought with us small things, a watch, a photograph, and, at my insistence, the toy E-Ward. As the fog swallowed us and the river hummed like a thing with cords, I tucked the toy into my jacket and felt its weight like a promise. We pushed out again into the place where the water forgot itself, and into an answer we had no right to demand. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We pushed out that night with the kind of care that comes from fear stitched into muscle memory. Ropes coiled, lanterns slung, every boat checked twice. The volunteers formed a ragged line along the bank like a prayer circle, flashlights bobbing. Lillian brought a deck of old Polaroids she said the river might like, faces, names, small histories, and Gus carried a pocket watch that had belonged to a man who'd never been found. Beth came too, silent and clenched, holding a folded photograph of Marcus and her father on a summer day. Officer Harris stayed at the marina, his jaw set, his radio clipped like armor. Jonah and I took the boat Marcus had used. The motor coughed and died twice before finding us a speed. The fog wrapped itself around the canal like wool. We placed the things we'd gathered in a small wicker basket. The toy E-Ward that had come back to us, the watch, the photograph. We tied the basket to a length of rope and started when the current felt like a suggestion and not a threat. There was no chant, no formal ritual. Lillian had written a note, names and dates in tiny, careful script, and tucked it under the stones in the center of the little cairn we'd found. "Say what you're willing to give," she told me before we pushed off. "Say it out loud. Don't dance around the truth." Her eyes were bright in the lantern light. I wasn't sure what I could put up that would mean anything to a river that had been swallowing people for decades. A watch? A toy? A photograph? Lillian's voice was a ruler against my chest. The river wants not just things, but the weight that attaches to them, memory, names, the stubborn habits that keep us anchored. So when Jonah looked at me and nodded, I took the toy from my jacket and held it like a relic. The initials were blurred where mud had softened the cheap plastic. "I'll say it," I told the water, because saying felt like bargaining. "I will give you a memory. Take it and let Marcus go." Jonah stared at me. "What memory?" The toy opened a seam in me, not a grand cinematic moment, but a small, crystalline thing. The afternoon at the pier when we were 7, when Marcus dared me to hold my breath longest and I pushed him under just to hear him laugh, and then he hit the water and screamed because the current caught his ankle, and I saw something in his face that wasn't laughter at all. It was a twinge of trust broken, and I sat on the dock while he spat water into his hands and told me never to be an idiot. We patched it with jokes and dares for years, but the memory lurked like an undercurrent. I had never told anyone that I had pushed him when he was too young, when the river had already been keeping secrets. "I give you the day I pushed him," I said into the fog. Saying it aloud made it a coin. Saying it made me tradable. Jonah's hand closed on my shoulder so hard I felt bone. "Ethan, do it," Beth said from the bank. "If that's what it takes." We placed the toy and the note and the watch on the cairn, and as Lillian had instructed, we named the thing we were trading. I said the words again, clearer. The memory of pushing Marcus and the face he made right after. I could feel the words leaving me like breath. For a long minute, nothing happened. The river's surface was an oily mirror. Then the pulse, that low, patient heartbeat, deepened, and the water answered with a soft, corralling sound. The stones warmed under my palms as if the river's attention had settled there. The rope slackened. A coolness brushed our hands. Something surfaced a little way off. Not a face at first, but a ripple that shaped itself into shoulders and then a head. Marcus was there, not climbing out like a rescued man, but emerging, water pulling bits of him back into smoothness. He coughed and blinked, and for a second his eyes were the old Marcus, bewildered and brilliant and bright with the relief of being back. "Marcus," I said, voice cracking. He stumbled toward the boat, and Jonah reached for him. He blinked at us and at Lillian's cairn. He picked up the toy without looking at it as if it were familiar, and then, confused, looked up at me with the same face I had seen the day he was pushed, the face that I had promised the river. Something had changed. Marcus could remember the sound of my name and the way the pier had splintered beneath our feet, but when I reached for a memory, the exact angle of the shove, the little flare of guilt that had chased me through adolescence, it was gone. My mind scraped at it and felt only fog. The day I'd traded was a blank, a polite hole where a crucial thing had been. I felt both lighter and hollow, like a pocket turned out. Marcus squinted as if trying to read me. "Ethan?" he asked. "You okay?" He smiled, a small, tentative thing. There was gratitude there, yes, but also a tilt, a question as if some part of him had been smoothed away to make room for whatever the river had wanted in return. He couldn't recall details about that week, about the weight of his father's last boat bill, about the exact pattern of nights he'd spent near the canal listening. It was as if the river had wiped some of the names written on its ledger and left us to fill the spaces with whatever we could. We pulled Marcus to shore. Beth hugged him until he almost disappeared in her arms. The town woke in the manner of a place that has seen too much and learned economy with reaction. No parades, just a slow, collective exhale. Officer Harris put Marcus through questions and checked him for signs of harm. Marcus answered, voice flat in parts, bright in others, like a radio with one faulty dial. He did not know everything, but he knew enough to be himself. He kept calling the river hungry, in a way that made everyone look at the water differently. In the days that followed, the river returned small things to us, a button, a shoelace, a scrap of denim. The carved symbol on the pilings faded gradually as if soothed by attention. Lillian said we had made an honest trade and that sometimes honesty was the only currency the water would honor. Jonah, who had been taught the way a rope is taught before it snaps, slept for a week. Gus went back to his nets but refused to go out at night alone. As for me, the hole left by the memory was its own kind of haunting. I could picture the day in a cinematic way, the sunlight, the water. But the spur, the exact shove, the tiny infraction that had changed everything, was gone. I could not summon the precise expression on Marcus's face in the second after I pushed him. Sometimes I would lie awake hunting for it like a diver searching for a shard in dark water and find only the curl of the toy in my palm. People in Benton Harbor began to talk about the forgetting as if it were a neighbor, respected, given its space. The river kept its moods. The town kept its rituals. Marcus stayed, at least for a while, taking in the town with a slow hunger for the things he'd lost. He learned again how to fix a motor, how to read the tides. Some nights he wandered down to the canal and sat with his feet in the water, like a man listening to a language he half remembered. I told this story because that's what we do. We tell tales to stitch ourselves back into shape. But there's a small, private sorrow that goes with it. What was gone from me is not recoverable. The river took a small, necessary cruelty from my past and left a hole where forgiveness might have lived. It gave Marcus back, but rearranged the map of us to fit its design. There are nights when the pulse returns in my chest and I think I hear little toy engines chugging across my dreams. Sometimes when the fog comes in low and you stand on the pier and watch the river fold the world in half, you will think you know what it asks for. It asks for stories, for names, for the small things that mark a life. It takes them and it gives them back in its own time, polished to its taste. We left it what it wanted, and it left us with one another, altered, grateful, and missing. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Lucas Hale. I was 27 years old on the night it all started, June 14th, 2019. I tell you that because dates matter in stories like this. They anchor you to the when and make the what feel less like fiction and more like a ledger of misfortune. I lived then on the east side of Benton Harbor, in a rental on Riverside Avenue, where the river smells like wet iron after rain and the streetlights hum like tired insects. I worked nights stocking shelves at a grocery on Leonard Street and spent my days pretending to sleep so people would believe I had a normal rhythm to my life. Benton Harbor, to anyone who hasn't been there, looks like a place that remembers better days. Old brick storefronts squat along the main drag, porches sag like tired mouths, and there's an old industrial stretch by the river where factories used to cough smoke and men with grease under their nails told stories over cheap coffee. We had a few faces that everyone knew. Mr. Larkin, who ran the bait shop by the pier, Sheriff Donnelly, who'd been in office a lifetime, and a handful of kids who skateboarded under the highway bridge like a brown river of motion and laughter. I knew them all in the way someone knows the furniture in a house they're crashing in. Familiar, useful, easy to ignore. I wasn't from Benton Harbor. I'd moved up from Ohio after a bad breakup and a worse landlord. I picked this town because you could still find a cheap room and the nights were quiet enough to think. I'd been here for 7 months, long enough to know which bars still had free jukeboxes and which neighbors complained if you mowed your lawn on a Sunday. Long enough, too, to meet people I'd start to trust. There was Rosa, mid-30s, a nurse who worked double shifts at Mercy General and kept jars of pickled green tomatoes in the freezer. There was Eli, a lanky mechanic who wore a soot-stained flannel-like armor and could fix anything except his own temper. And there was Jamie, the only coworker I felt like telling secrets to, a barista by day who worked nights also to keep her student loans from swallowing her whole. On paper, my life was small and neat. I lived alone in a place with bad insulation and a leaky sink. I could count my friends on 2 hands and my enemies on none. People in Benton Harbor had that way of living close to danger and pretending they weren't. The river could flood in spring and the power would go out on turnpike nights, but somehow, everyone still left their doors unlocked on weekdays. Maybe that was why it all felt manageable, like the risk was part of the town's charm. Those first months, I filled my spare hours with anything to avoid thinking too hard. I walked the waterfront, watching the freighters move like slow beasts. I learned the rhythm of gulls and the times the city buses came by. I scribbled notes for a novel I never started, half-wrote songs I'd forget by breakfast, and drank coffee until my hands shook. The people I worked with became a kind of family of the temporarily desperate. Shared casseroles, dog-eared paperback books traded over the back counter, the kind of inside jokes that sound foolish to anyone else but keep you from feeling alone. Before that night, the scariest thing that had happened to me in Benton Harbor was when someone swiped my front tire and left my bike like a sacrificed limb on the sidewalk. I called it bad luck and moved on. That's important to remember, how small events can make you underestimate the larger ones. Fear in a town like ours is usually polite. It knocks, waits, and often leaves. What came that June was rude, immediate, and it didn't bother with courtesies. I'll tell you about the people I was with that night because they become witnesses, whether they want to be or not. Rosa had the bright laugh that cut through worry, and she worked nights at the hospital's trauma unit. Eli's hands were always stained, his jaw always set, and he carried a pocket knife like a relic. Jamie had quick eyes and a tendency to flash a grin when you needed it most. Each of them had reasons to be up on a Saturday. Rosa had a shift that ran late, Eli was finishing up at the garage, and Jamie had been working an open mic at the Black Cat Cafe until midnight. I crossed paths with all three without thinking much of it. Small-town lives overlap in ways that feel accidental until they aren't. We all agreed to meet by the old pier at the edge of town. A wooden scar jutting into the river where, in daylight, fishermen traded tall tales, and at night the wind made the boards sound like distant thunder. The pier had been patched up so many times, the wood had a patchwork that looked like a map of things better left unvisited. We said we'd hang out, watch the barges, and go back to someone's house for cheap beer. Nothing fancy. No one planned for the night to bend. I told myself that when I walked those last few blocks to the pier, every noise was ordinary. A dog barking, a bottle breaking, the distant exhale of someone's radio. The streetlight on Riverview had gone out a week earlier, and the darkness pooled in that corner like spilled ink. I remember thinking how ordinary the air smelled. The river, a hint of fried food from a late truck, the metallic tang of a town waking and sleeping by turns. My hands were in my jacket pockets. My phone said it was 11:47 p.m. I like to know the time. It cures the imagination of a lot of ghosts. The main story, the thing that rewrites what a place means to you, I'll start telling you about now. We had been on the pier for less than an hour when the first oddity happened. A sound that didn't belong to the river. A high, thin note like someone testing a glass. It came from the woods behind the old canning plant, where blackberry bushes grew and the path narrowed into weeds. At first we laughed it off, saying it was a fox or a wind through a bent pipe. But the sound came again, and this time it had a pattern, as though someone was tapping a message against the trees. We all stopped. Rosa said, "Probably kids," and Eli said, "Kids don't come out this late." Jamie, who had been strumming an absent rhythm on her knee, put her hand over her chest and said nothing. That tapping turned into footsteps, not the clumsy clack of sneakers, but the measured, patient steps of someone who knows exactly where they want to be. The river went mute around us, as if even it had stopped to listen. I told myself to laugh, to make a joke about the pier being haunted, but my voice stuck behind my teeth. The wooden planks creaked under our shoes, and the night seemed suddenly too close. You can feel when a place changes its tone. The pier, the river, the rusty teeth of the city seemed to straighten up and look at us. I didn't know then whether to run, call someone, or stand still and pretend nothing was wrong. The choice we made that night would be the one that kept the story alive in my head forever. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the footsteps came close enough to smell the rot of the riverbank in the air, Eli hissed, "We should go." His voice had a brittle edge I hadn't heard before, the kind that happens when someone surprises themselves being afraid. Jamie grabbed my sleeve like a lifeline and pulled. Rosa squinted toward the dark and whispered, "Maybe it's just someone lost." But none of us sounded convinced. We stepped off the pier, and the sound followed, keeping pace not on the boards but in the mouth of the path that led into the broken lot beside the old canning plant. There, the telephone poles leaned like tired soldiers, and the weeds had taken back what the factory left. Someone, something, was moving through the shadows with an intent that made the air cold on my skin. We cut across the lot, feet sinking into the soft, damp earth toward the lamplight of Riverview. Everyone hustled, shoulders bumped, no one speaking. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning for a silhouette, for a flash of denim or a reflection, anything to name the source of that tapping. The sound didn't stop. It changed timbre, became a low rhythm, like someone pacing in the dark while they counted to something only they knew. When we reached the corner where the bus stop sat under a flickering sign, Jamie stopped. "My car's a block over," she said. "Wait here." She should have sounded confident and casual. Instead, she looked small under the streetlight. A kid waiting to be picked up after curfew. "We'll go together," she added, like convincing herself. Jamie walked off down the side street that ran past the bakery. We watched her go until she turned the corner, and then, because we were stupid and because fear makes you test fate, Eli and I followed at a distance. Rosa lingered, hands jammed in her pockets, eyes wide on the empty street like someone trying to memorize it. I kept my head down, my steps quick. The neighborhood smelled of yeast and something burnt from the bakery ovens. The tapping sound had stopped a few minutes earlier, and the silence now felt like someone holding a breath. Then, from the dark between two houses, a figure stepped out. At first I thought it was Jamie. The shape was slim, and it moved with a strange lurch, as if the joints preferred a different rhythm than ours. It wore a jacket that might have been dark green and a hat pulled low. No face was visible in the streetlight. It carried nothing in its hands, yet the air around it felt like the kind of cold you get when a window opens in winter and the whole room remembers it. Jamie, who had been maybe 30 feet ahead now, did not notice. She walked past the figure without a glance, humming. The relief that rose in my chest was a foolish, immediate thing, and I let myself exhale. But the figure did not move on. It stayed in the same place until Jamie had gone a few yards. Then it moved too, not following exactly, but taking a channel through the shadows that would put it between her and the road. "Jamie," I called, but my voice sounded thin. She didn't turn. Eli and I picked up our pace. The figure shifted its head in a way that made the streetlight catch something metallic at its throat. For a second I thought it was a chain. Then I saw it was a glint of teeth when the thing tilted its head the wrong way. By the time we reached the corner, the scene had become a small theater of motion. Jamie was frozen on the sidewalk, phone in hand, looking down at the screen like she was trying to find a number she'd typed wrong. The figure stood directly across from her, and the space between them felt wrong. Too small, like a door that wanted to close. I remember the exact moment my legs failed me. I had taken one step toward Jamie and Eli grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a whisper, but a force. "We call someone. We don't run at it." His hands were shaking. Rosa, who had been a block behind, rounded the corner then. She took in the tableau and, without thinking, shouted Jamie's name. The sound cut the night. Jamie looked up, and for a heartbeat, everything broke into ordinary pieces again. She laughed, an attempt at a joke. The figure, whatever it was, raised its hands slowly and, in a voice that had no business being human, said, "Good evening." That voice, calm like a man addressing an audience at a library event, made my stomach drop. It had a rhythm I couldn't place, a flattened vowel that suggested the speaker had spent a long time holding words in reserve. Jamie took another step back. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the pavement with a clatter that sounded too loud. We called out, "Hey, who are you?" Eli's voice had gone brittle again. The figure did not answer the question with a name. Instead, it asked us, "Do you remember the ferryman?" The words were casual, like a grocery list item, but they landed on us as if someone had changed the weather. None of us knew that joke. But the ferryman, the phrase, hummed through the back of my skull. A story I'd half heard in a bar once about an old man who guided barges at night. I don't know why the thing used that phrase, but it had teeth in it. Jamie laughed then, but it was a terrified sound, and she said, "Very funny. Okay, guys, enough." The figure moved sideways, just a step, and the lamplight hit its face. It wasn't a face so much as a blot of shadow with eyes like paper holes. For a moment, I thought I could see the outline of a smile. Whatever lay beneath the hat was wrong. The cheekbones seemed too prominent, the jaw too long. It spoke again. "You shouldn't have come by the pier." "I live here," Jamie said. The sentence came out small. "None of you do," the thing said. "Not the way I mean." That's when the world tightened. The neighbors' windows remained dark. A dog barked twice and stopped. A car passed down Leonard Street, and the driver looked straight ahead as if driving through fog. My hands were numb, my throat raw. Eli reached for the closest thing he could find, a discarded broom handle leaning against a stoop, and took a step forward. I don't remember who moved first after that. I only remember the crack of wood on something that didn't sound like flesh, the sound of a scuffle, Jamie's scream like a broken bell, and then darkness. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the world came back to me, it did so in pieces. A bright ceiling, a needle prick in my arm, the smell of antiseptic, and a voice that kept saying my name like it was testing whether I still belonged to it. I learned later that I'd been in and out for a long time. Eli had dragged me clear of the scuffle, Rosa had called an ambulance, and Jamie had vanished in that seam of shadow between houses. Sheriff Donnelly swore they searched every lot, every culvert, every abandoned loading dock for hours, but the night kept her like breath kept underwater. In the hospital, my ribs ached like I'd been hugged by concrete, my head throbbed along the lines of an invisible map, and the doctors kept talking about concussions and observation. I said the first thing that came into my mouth, "Where's Jamie?" They blinked at me as though I'd asked about a woman who'd fallen through a trapdoor of the world. "She never came in," one nurse said, "Mr. Hale." The way she said my name made it clear I was supposed to accept that answer as if it explained anything. People in Benton Harbor wrapped themselves around the night in the way small towns do, with rumor for blankets and suspicion as a pillow. The paper ran a short piece, "Local woman missing after night at pier." They printed a photo of Jamie with a grin too small for the headline. Sheriff Donnelly came by my room, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. He asked the questions police ask. Who were you with? What were you drinking? Did anyone have a grudge? His pen scratched the paper like he didn't expect real truth to be on it. The town had stories. Everyone has them, about the old canning plant and the ferryman who once guided barges and men home. Mr. Larkin told it over coffee at the bait shop like it was a fact his father taught him. "Ferryman," he said, tapping his mug. "Not the kind with boats, son. The kind that takes a look at a person and decides they belong on the other side of the river. Folks said he likes the piers at night." People laughed nervously when he said it, like naming the thing might make it polite. I listened because you listen to anything that might explain why the dark looked at you for too long. Jamie's disappearance split the town in ways you could measure with small acts. Neighbors pulled their curtains in daylight, bar stools cleared when my name was mentioned, and the college kids who used to skate under the bridge stopped coming around. Rosa went back to work a week after, folding trauma into her schedule like a practiced seamstress. Eli stopped fixing cars for 2 nights, and then got back under a hood as though greasy hands could hold back what touched us. For me, the fear didn't come only in the dark. It came in quiet rooms at 2 in the afternoon. The day mocking the night by pretending to be safe. I found myself walking the river at odd hours, drawn like a moth to the place that had become a wound. I would stand on the pier and feel the planks under my feet, listen for tapping, a pattern, anything familiar. Sometimes there were only crickets and the lazy slap of water. Sometimes the boards would give a soft complaint and my mouth would go dry. Weeks passed. The sheriff eventually downgraded Jamie's case from missing person to unresolved, the way one downgrades storms after they've passed. People stopped putting up flyers. Life, that slow civic animal, settled back into its grooves. But there were nights I woke and heard a single soft tap on the window of my bedroom, like a knuckle of someone polite and insistent. Once, a thin voice called down the alley outside my building and said, "Do you remember the ferryman?" It sounded like someone imitating a story. I didn't answer. One night, 3 months after that one that changed us, I couldn't stand it anymore. I told Rosa I was fine because I hadn't yet found the courage to tell her otherwise, and Eli was at the garage, which made him reliably unavailable for good and bad decisions alike. I walked to the pier alone with a flashlight and a coat, and the stupid thin hope that I could find a trace of what had happened to Jamie. A shoe, a jacket, anything that would be a decisive shape against the town's fog of forgetfulness. The pier remembered me. The boards predicted my weight and complained accordingly. I walked to the far edge where the river sighed against the pilings and set the flashlight down. The beam cut a pale wedge across the water. For a while, there was only the ordinary chorus, the river, distant horns, a gull arguing with a lamppost. Then, as if the town itself was taking a breath, a pattern returned, that slow, measured tapping from the blackberry thicket behind the canning plant. I could have walked away. I didn't. That's the awful pride of survivors. They think confronting the shape of fear will make it reasonable. I followed the sound into the lot. The flashlight made a skinny place of the world. It turned weeds into a cathedral of shadows. The tapping led me to a collapsed doorway where the factory threw off rain and winter like an old coat. There on the ground lay a small object catching light. A phone, cracked, its screen black but for a pale spiderweb of fracture. My hands shook as I picked it up. Inside the case was a wheel of images and one thing that saw through me. A selfie of Jamie, cheeky and alive, time-stamped at 11:51 p.m. The last frame showed her looking back over her shoulder, not at the camera but at something behind her, a smear in the dark that could have been anything and yet looked like intent. I played a voice message and for a second the air tightened. A voice, not Jamie's, whispering a phrase I'd heard before. "Good evening. Do you remember the ferryman?" Then static and a final sound, a scraping like a nail on a plate. I took the phone to Sheriff Donnelly. He listened with his head bowed, and afterward took me by the shoulder the way people do when they want to anchor someone who might drift. "We'll reopen it," he said. He said many comforting things on the way to saying not enough. They dug through the lot with the city crews. They checked the riverbanks with flashlights and boats. They called in divers who found mud and riverweed and the bones of things that belonged to animals. They found no elongated footprints, no markers, no signature that could be pinned to a man's name. People want endings. We want closure like baked bread, warm and complete. Benton Harbor gave me none. What I got instead were partial answers and the feeling that the place itself had decided to keep some of its inventory private. Months after Jamie vanished, a barstool rumor said she'd been seen boarding a freighter at 2 a.m. Another said she'd walked into the factory and joined the ghosts who lived in the rafters. Theories stacked like old newspapers, useful for lining bird cages, but nothing close to the truth. I learned to live with it by small compromises. I left the pier to others. I stopped walking alone at night. I kept the cracked phone in a drawer with other relics, a broken key, a matchbook from the Black Cat Cafe, a note Jamie had passed me once about taking a writing class. Sometimes, late, I would open the phone and listen to the static until the edges of the sound blurred and somehow my breathing matched it. Years later, when someone asked me if Benton Harbor had always been what that night made it, I said no and yes at the same time. It's still the town with sagging porches and honest bait shop owners and people who know your name at the corner store. But in the gaps, the alleyways at midnight, the rotten boards at the pier, there's a promise that some doors are better left shut. I left town for a while after that. I came back because I was stubborn and because some parts of you belong to a place even when they hurt. The scars, like faded graffiti, mark you. They do not always explain. If there is one thing I would tell you, someone listening at a kitchen table or leaning against a lamppost with a cigarette half finished, it's this. Names and dates are useful, but they are also tiny things against a river's appetite. Be careful where you let your feet lead you at night. Some places keep their own accounts, and sometimes they settle them in ways no one else will ever understand. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jonah Whitfield. I was 29 years old the night it happened, October 12th, 2018. I tell this as plain as I can because Benton Harbor deserves the truth, even when the truth sounds like something a cautionary tale would tell children at a slumber party. People in the town still whisper about nights when the wind comes off the lake wrong and the streetlights hum like they're trying to speak. I lived on the edge of town, where asphalt gives up to marsh and old railroad tracks, in a faded two-story that had belonged to my grandmother. I fixed things for a living, not big things. Door locks, a boarded window here, a furnace that coughed and gave up. Most nights I worked as a maintenance tech at the Harborview Diner and shut the place down long after the last coffee cup had cooled. Benton Harbor is a place that leans on the past like a man with a cane. It has a river that braids through the city, a handful of neighborhoods where porches sag under the memory of better days, and a few buildings that never quite decided whether they were abandoned or merely waiting. There's an old tannery by the waterfront, a small, stubborn movie theater that still runs double features on Sundays, and a waterfront park where the grass grows in stubborn blue-green patches. Locals joke that the town is like an old tattoo, beautiful, faded, and possibly infected in places. I wasn't the kind of person who chased ghosts. I respected facts. I liked schedules and receipts and being able to name everything. But I had a weakness for stories. The kind told over a cheap beer at Miller's Bar or pulled from the pockets of old men who remembered names that no one else did. Stories were how folks stitched community together. You talked about the time the river flooded in '93, or the time the diner's jukebox blew a speaker and everyone pretended it was art. People named places like the Whitaker Mill or Klein's Bridge as if they were people themselves. They have moods, the townsfolk would say. You'd nod, you'd sip another beer, you'd remember the time the lights went out on your street and you slept like a child anyway. The cast in my life was small and loyal. There was Marcus Hale, my best friend since high school, loud, quick to laugh, and always with a plan for getting into trouble that somehow involved his old red pickup. Marcus worked nights at the chemical plant and had a dog named Otis who believed he was a man. There was Liza Porter, everyone called her Liza P., who ran the florist stand on East Main and cooked the best Sunday gravy I'd ever had. Liza had a laugh like someone reading a great secret aloud. My landlord, Silas Granger, was a quiet man who collected clocks. They filled his hallway like a small forest. My life moved in a comfortable orbit of shifts, repairs, and pizza on TV. I dated a woman named Maya for 2 years before we realized we were better as friends and decided, with the clumsiest honesty, to stay that way. We kept the kind of friendship that knew the exact brand of cereal each of us bought and the photographs of pets we'd never meet. I liked the steadiness. Maybe that's why the violent, sudden interruption of steadiness in October hit me so hard. There were small signs I could have read as warnings. Birds avoiding the river one week, a smell that settled over the dock like oil. Men at the diner muttered about a new developer sniffing around the wharf, but stories in Benton Harbor often came with a price tag. Developers meant demolition, and demolition meant opening up things that had slept too long. I told myself that's what was happening. Old concrete being tested, pipes examined, the human sort of invasive inspection. I had no reason to think otherwise. Not until the night the streetlight outside my house went out in a way that looked deliberate, like someone had taken a breath and held it. On October 12th, I worked a double shift. A burnt toast morning at the diner, then a call for emergency lock repairs at a small manufacturing warehouse near the old rail yard. The sky was low, and the kind of gray that felt like a promise of rain that would never commit. Marcus had joked on my lunch break that the ghosts of Benton Harbor were unionizing, and Liza left me a vase of orange dahlias with a note. Don't wait up. I left the diner at 9, drove past storefronts with letters missing from their signs, and took Lorraine Road that runs closer to the river. That road has always been quieter, a ribbon between the town and whatever lies beyond the water. I parked near the Whitaker property because the warehouse was closer to the old mill. The Whitaker place is a hulking thing, if you haven't seen it. Rotted wood, a roof that sags, windows like eyes gone blind. Kids used to dare each other to step over the broken fence, but the town has a way of letting places like the Whitaker keep their own privacy without fuss. The moon that night was a pale coin and hung low. It did nothing to make the place friendly. I should have been home before midnight. Instead, the lock at the warehouse had a temper. Rusted, sticky. I worked for an hour more than I planned, scraping stubborn bolts and whispering at a metal door like it could be reasoned with. Around midnight, I finally shut the door, wiped my hands, and realized my phone was dead. I reached for the charger in my truck and found my battery only a sliver left, 40% and sinking fast. Typical coincidences felt like the universe lining up pins for something else to knock over. I drove back toward my house along Lorraine, windows down a bit. The river had a surface like old glass, and somewhere upstream a freight horn sighed once and then again. As I crossed the small bridge by the mill, a figure appeared on the far shore, standing with his back to me where the path met the water. He wore an old coat that looked too big, and his posture was straight as a pole. For a second, I thought it was Silas checking his clocks under the stars, but Silas didn't stand by the river at midnight. He also didn't have a flashlight angling the wrong way. The man raised his head and looked toward me. At first, I thought he lifted his hand to wave. Then I saw that he had nothing in his hand at all. He simply cupped it at his mouth as if to shout into the dark. The sound never came. By the time I slowed the truck, the figure had disappeared into the fringe of trees. I joked about being jumpy, blamed the long night and the coffee, and told myself I'd laugh about it with Marcus the next morning. I locked the truck and started walking up the cracked sidewalk toward my house. That was when the first real thing happened. Something I could not justify as tired eyes or a town's habit of whispering. I felt the air change, not colder but thicker, as if someone had poured syrup into the atmosphere. The hairs on my neck prickled. From 2 houses down, the streetlight that had been steady for years flickered, then went out, as if someone had reached across the neighborhood and pinched the light out. The world reduced to the wet black of the night, and the river hummed under that darkness like a living thing. I kept walking because it's what I knew how to do. People walk when they're scared. They walk to get home. They walk so they can lock a door and pull a blanket over whatever worries there are. But when I reached my porch and dug for my keys, I could not find the metal weight in my pocket. My hand came away with lint and a small, folded slip of paper I didn't recognize. A square of printed card with a single sentence on it, typed in a font I'd never seen. "We watched the light go out for you." I had never seen that font before. I had never felt the kind of freeze that felt like someone pressing their thumb across the center of your chest. Before I could breathe properly, I heard a noise from the direction of the river, a soft, laboring cough that might have been a motor, or might have been someone trying to move through dead leaves. The sound was close enough that it could have been someone stepping on the rail at the back of my property. I stood frozen, the paper in my hand like an accusation. I'd always believed in explanations. Good men are built on that faith. But standing there under a sky that preferred not to be noticed, I felt something else. A sense that the town itself had shifted its weight and left me standing alone. That was the precise, terrible moment everything pivoted. The rest of the night was a long and crooked fall. I couldn't stop. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The paper trembled in my fist like a small, defeated animal. For a moment, I thought I must be dreaming, that long nights at the diner had finally staged a revolt against me. But the damp on the porch rail was real, and the stiff print of the note was real enough to cut the skin if you held it wrong. I folded it into my palm and listened. The neighborhood held its breath. I didn't tell Marcus right away. That's what friends are for. They make jokes and punch your arm and tell you you're overreacting. So, I did what I always did. I put the paper on the kitchen table, made coffee that could strip paint, and tried to think like a man who understood locks and bolts and heat exchangers. I told myself 1,000 reasonable things. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe a kid down the street crawled through the hedge and left a note to scare a dog. Maybe the developer had people there doing midnight inspections and they'd left a message that looked like a threat, because that's what bored men do on work nights. I called Marcus at 3 a.m. because he was the kind of man who didn't sleep much, and because there is strength in numbers, even when the number is only 2. He grunt laughed when I explained, the kind of laugh that meant, "You're being dramatic and I'll be there." He showed up 20 minutes later, the truck's headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the fog. Otis was in the passenger seat, snuffling as if he knew the night had teeth. We walked down to the river together. The town looked different, with Marcus beside me, somehow braver, or maybe the town simply seemed more human when not alone. We passed the Whitaker boundary, the fence sagging and pregnant with ivy. The air was a stew of river rot and the unmistakable tang of something chemical, not the usual detergent smell from the plant, but a sharper, cleaner note that put a metallic taste in the back of my throat. There were tracks at the waterline, not human footprints, too many of those in Benton Harbor, but something like a dragged pattern, as if heavy boots had brushed against the mud and left a grooved trail toward the old rail bridge. We followed it, flashlights cutting arcs across the reeds. The bridge itself looked worse up close, boards missing, cables frayed like an old man's beard. Under the bridge, the water moved slower, oil mottled, reflecting our beams like guilty eyes. "I don't like this," Marcus said, which is practically the same as saying run. Otis let out a low bark and strained at his leash. We found other things near the bridge, a shard of a mirror, a woman's glove, no owner in sight, and more of those printed cards with the same strange serif. Some had short sentences. One read, "We kept count until the light blinked twice." If you'd asked me then what I thought, I would have said that I believed in people's capacity to be cruel. That's the shortcut most of us take. Bad things are human-made. But a cruel human leaves fingerprints, leaves motives, leaves a trail that leads to names and addresses. These cards led to neither. They felt manufactured, like part of a language only the town's older, darker corners still spoke. We continued upstream until the path opened onto the old tannery lot. It sits like a wound, low and wide, with a skeleton of brick walls that used to hold the town's livelihood. Kids used to dare each other there. Older folks warned us off. The tannery smelled like old leather and time. In the lot, someone had arranged a ring of stones, small, clean, and unnervingly deliberate. In the middle of the circle lay a single, rusted pocket watch, cracked open like an insect. The face read 12-7. Silas always said clocks lie when people make them watch lies, and in that moment I almost believed him. "That's not random," Marcus said. "Someone planned this." We left the watch where it was and took pictures. It's a stupid modern instinct to document the irrational, an insurance policy against being called a liar. Later, when the pictures were shared at Miller's bar, a few old men nodded and read meaning into the angle of the watch hand as if it were tea leaves. But in the moment, what I felt most was smallness, as if the town had folded itself in half and we were looking at the crease. That night, the world split into two kinds of sounds. The normal, a far-off dog, the river's patient chew, and the wrong ones. A hum that settled like a blanket in a speed that made my skin vibrate, a soft clicking that might have been machinery or might have been teeth. Around 3:30, while Marcus took Otis back to the truck, I wandered closer to the tannery wall and found a name scratched into the brick with a slow, methodical hand. Elliot Franks. Below it, a date, 1974. Below that, the word watched. Elliot Franks was not a name I knew, but Benton Harbor has an archive of forgotten names. The diner's owner used to tell me stories about a man who worked the tannery and vanished without a whisper. They said he'd gone walking near the river and never come back. Old rumors are like the town's map. You can follow them if you want, but you might get lost. The name on the wall hooked something in me I did not want hooked. Marcus and I left at dawn, the fog lifting like a curtain. We tried on explanations like coats, zealots, kids, tramps, developers with a dark sense of humor. None fit quite right. I slept for a bit on the couch and dreamed of clocks stacking up like dominoes. When I woke, there were 10 voicemails from Liza asking if I'd seen the news. A woman missing, last seen near the wharf. Her name was Hannah Tremaine. The description was loose, but Hannah was someone who sold homemade pies at the market and had the kind of laugh that made old dogs stand up straighter. People know how to disappear in a town like ours, leaving behind receipts and salt shakers. But when someone who feeds the town vanishes, you feel it in your chest like a punch. I called the number the paper in my pocket had come from, the same number listed nowhere, like a ghost line, and the call clicked dead. The cops were polite, but anemic. "We'll tag it," the sergeant said, which you learn in this sort of place is the language of trying and not promising. They asked if I'd walk them through everything. I did. I told them about the cards, the watch, the name in the brick. The sergeant wrote notes, his pen scratching a rhythm that made me think of heartbeats and slow arithmetic. He told me to keep my phone on and to report anything else. He promised he'd send a unit to the tannery. He did not promise answers. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and arranged the cards in a line, trying to make a sentence. The cards didn't form words. They formed an impression, like the shadow of a hand, rather than the hand itself. I kept thinking about the watch in the tannery, about the name etched in the brick, about the feeling that the town had been watching something for a long time and now expected me to notice. At 2:07 a.m., my phone buzzed and flashed with a message that had no number attached. The words were simple. It said, "Look out the back." I walked toward the window as if sleepwalking. Outside, on the far side of the yard where the reeds met the fence, something reflected the streetlight, an eye catching the glow and returning it like a dare. I stood there until the light blinked twice. Then, from the black line of the river, I heard the sound of counting, faint, deliberate, and the hum returned, deeper now, as if whatever had leaned in to listen had found a rhythm. I shut the curtains and almost laughed at myself for being the kind of man who believed in watchful things. But laughter felt like breaking a promise. Instead, I put on my boots and my jacket and grabbed a flashlight. If there was one thing I had built my life around, it was turning up when things needed fixing. That night, I went to see which part of my town was broken. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped out into a night that felt colder than the air itself, as if the darkness had a temperature. The flashlight made a pale cone that trembled with my hand. Otis padded beside me, ears forward, the dog's muzzle catching the beam and throwing it back like an awkward mirror. Marcus had dozed in the truck and snored the kind of snore that belonged to men who believed the world would keep turning even if they didn't. I left him there. Some things you go to alone because afraid men move differently than brave ones. You notice details they'd miss, a shoe print half covered by river silt, the way a reed leans as if bowing. I followed the path back to the tannery, where the ring of stones waited like a slow accusation. The cards were nowhere near as harmless in the beam of my flashlight. The printing glinted, the serif sharp and deliberate, as though someone had prepared them with the same care a watchmaker might give a spring. They were arranged differently here, tucked under a stone, stuck to a rusted bolt, threaded through the eye of a broken hinge. The words on each card were short, a handful forming a sentence that I couldn't or wouldn't assemble. We count. We keep. We do not forget. I crouched and read one aloud, my voice small and ridiculous in the open air. One watch for two lights. The sentence landed like a pebble into a still pond. Otis wuffed and nosed the earth. For a moment I thought hearing was a betrayal, listening to words that liked corners and shadows. Then I heard it, the click. A soft metronomic sound under the hum like teeth tapping porcelain. It came from the direction of the old boiler room. The tannery's boiler room had been gutted for years, pipes dangling, valves that had not felt a hand in decades. I pushed a metal door that protested and climbed down into a hollow that smelled of yesterday's heat. The flashlight caught the curve of a shadow, and there was Hannah Tremaine, sitting on a crate, hair pulled loose, eyes unfocused like someone who had watched too much and slept too little. She looked smaller than the woman who sold pies on Saturdays. Her hands were clean, which struck me as odd. "Hannah?" My voice sounded like it belonged to a different man. She blinked, and when she smiled, it was like a bulb being screwed into a socket. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was thin, not scared so much as tired. "They don't like witnesses." "Who doesn't like witnesses?" I asked. The click grew louder, as if pleased to have been noticed. She touched the pocket watch that sat on her palm, the same rusted, cracked thing we'd seen in the stone ring. "They watch the lights," she said. "They keep the count. The town forgets, Jonah. Sometimes the town forgets to keep its side of the bargain." At first I thought bargain was the wrong word. Bargains are made by clever men with pens and signatures. This felt older, a debt carved into the bones of the place. Hannah told me about winters when the river rose and carried away children's toys and the fishermen's nets. About a time when the tannery ran night shifts and men sang to keep awake. She told me about Elliot Franks, the name on the brick, a man who refused to look away, who sat at the riverbank and counted the lights from the other shore. He'd been laughed at, then dismissed, then simply not there anymore. He didn't stop watching, Hannah said, so someone made sure the town kept watching with him. "You sound like you believe in ghosts," I said, the laugh brittle. Hannah's fingers curled around the watch. "I believe in promises," she said. "The river wants a pattern. It wants rhythm. When the rhythm breaks, something comes up to check the score." She was not a prophet, not in the theatrical sense. She was a woman with flour on her palms and a tired grace. She had the face of someone who had watched small things go missing before they became large things. I wanted to take her home to make coffee and put blankets around her, but Hannah shook her head. "They mark those who look," she said quietly. "You've been marked." Her finger traced the inside of my wrist, like a question. I watched where she traced and felt a pressure there that was not there the day before. A rawness, as if an invisible band had brushed the skin. I had not noticed it until she pointed it out. "You're making this up," I said, because men can believe in the improbable if they must, but make from it a comfortable story. Hannah's eyes did not flinch. She pressed the watch into my palm. The minute hand, beneath the spider web of cracks, trembled and then clicked once, twice, to a rhythm that made my teeth ache. "You keep count now," she said. "You have to. It's what they asked of Elliot. It's what the town forgets to do on its own." Back on the surface, the world had a different pitch. The hum was a conversation between unseen things, lower now, like a neighbor speaking in their sleep. I walked home with the watch in my jacket. I turned it over and found, faint as a scar, numbers scratched into the metal. 12/07/1974. Elliot's date, the night that everything started to tilt. I thought of Silas and his clocks, and felt a sudden affinity for repossessed time, the way men try to keep machinery honest by winding and setting and trusting something with teeth to tick true. That night at the diner the next morning, the town tasted smaller and more secretive. People moved around like they'd been given new lines to say in old plays. The sergeant called to tell me they'd canvassed the wharf, but found nothing. Liza brought me a cup of gravy that tasted like courage. Marcus pretended not to worry, but his thumb twitched on the steering wheel when he thought no one looked. Hannah stayed at the market but avoided my eyes. Her pies sold out like contraband. Then 3 days later, a child found another watch. This one was buried in the sand at the waterfront, wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked in like a message in a bottle. The face read the exact same time. Nobody could explain how two identical watches could exist unless someone had forged them or stolen them from the same pocket. Either explanation still felt human. The thing is, sometimes human explanations are not enough. Sometimes a town keeps secrets because the secret is the shape of the town. They started showing up more often. Watches, cards, names. The paper cards were never the same sentence twice. Some read like bureaucratic notes, keeping compliance. Others were less clinical. We forgive the light. Forgive us. Each one was a drop in a pool that widened the more we tried to measure it. The sergeant stopped returning my calls as often. People at Miller's Bar exchanged glances and then laughed when I said the words out loud. Ritual. Ritual is the kind of word that makes a town rearrange itself. We are a place that tells itself stories about why things happen. Ritual is the kind of story that needs people willing to believe and eventually believe back. Late one night, I walked down to the river again, the watch heavy in my hand. The moon was a sliver. The fog rose like steam off the water, and the whistle of a freight train stitched the horizon. I sat on the railing and felt the town sloping away behind me. I felt watched, not with eyes, but with intention, like being observed by a clock that kept correct time. I put the watch against my heart because it felt like the last sensible place to keep something that tells you about time. Then, beneath the steady hum, I heard it, counting. Not a tune or a ghostly whisper, but precise, the arithmetic of something patient. 1, 2, 3. The count came slow, then sped like a metronome, losing its temper. I felt my jaw tighten. The watch in my hand clicked in sympathy, like an echo answering its maker. The air around me seemed to gather, and for the second time in a week, I felt something press its weight against the town's thin skin. "Who's there?" I called into the fog, and the counting stopped like a held breath. For a long, empty second, the river answered with nothing but the sound of water folding itself over stone. Then a voice, not human but not wholly other, answered with a neighborly politeness that made my skin crawl. "You were counted," it said, as if reading the day's mail. "You are due." Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The voice on the river had the politeness of someone delivering bad news. You were counted. You are due. It sounded like a neighbor telling you your meter had been read. My throat closed on a laughter that wouldn't come. You ask where courage comes from in late-night moments when everything sensible says run. For me, it was a stubborn oath I'd whispered to myself when I was a kid, that I would go back for people who couldn't go back for themselves. Maybe that's vanity dressed up as valor. Maybe it's the only kind of vanity that helps in a small town where debts are carved in brick. I answered the voice, which is absurd in hindsight. What does that even mean? I said, trying for steady and landing somewhere between a dare and a confess. The fog held the words and returned them as riddles. Elliot watched, the voice said. We kept it. We kept the pattern. You missed 3 counts. We account. We collect. Hannah's fingers were in mine, cold and real and strong in the way of someone who had decided to stop trembling. She had been given something to do, or had taken it, and she wore the weight differently than a rung on a ladder. I should have tried to pry the watch from my jacket and smash it against the rail. Instead, I held it like someone carrying a lit cigarette after a funeral, careful, ashamed, and incapable of letting go. The counting resumed, not a voice now, but the sound of the town itself. The click of an old streetlight, a truck shifting gears in the distance, a dog sighing. Each sound held a number, and the numbers stitched together like a hem. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm widened to swallow the space around us. Due started to feel like a timetable you could not argue with, like a bus schedule that would not let you off once you'd boarded. I thought of Marcus sleeping in the truck, trusting the world to remain indifferent because it had never asked much of him. I thought of Liza arranging flowers that morning, unaware she had been counted as a kindness. I thought of Silas and the clocks lining his hallway, each one a person who insisted time meant something. Obligation can look a lot like heroism when you draw close to it. You can stop, Hannah said. She squeezed my hand and leaned so close I heard the cotton of her sleeve. You can refuse, Jonah. You can burn the watches, bury them, sell them for scrap. Then what? I asked. My voice sounded very small, the way it does when you try to push a boulder with your thumb. What happens when the town forgets again? They'll knock until someone remembers, she said. They're not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They're habitual. Habitual. That's what you call things that were once practical and now are only ritual. In Benton Harbor, you could hear how rituals sounded. A metronome, a town remembering, a promise made to water and cold brick. People will forgive a lot when they can tell themselves there is a reason. I made a choice that night that has weight every morning. I opened my shop or set a coffee on Marcus's workbench. I took the watch to the river's edge, and with hands that shook, I cracked it open and hurled the innards into the water. The pieces glittered and were gone like a coin tossed. For a heartbeat, the hum lifted, like someone lifting a hand from a sleeping dog, and I felt a laugh rise up that tasted like victory. Then the river answered not with peace, but with a ripple that felt like a reprimand. You cannot destroy certain promises. You can break the physical thing that represents them, but the pattern lives in other places, in names, in the shape towns make when they gather at the edge of their own maps. That night, the watches in the sand stuttered and went still. The cards ceased appearing on doorsteps. For a few weeks, Benton Harbor felt like a town that had stopped coughing. We slept. We ate. We reconstructed normal like a house with a new roof. But the debt doesn't always vanish when you do something brave. Sometimes it asks for a different kind of payment. A week later, Marcus didn't come home from the plant. His truck was found where he'd left it at the end of his shift. Engine cold, Otis nowhere in sight. The sergeant said he probably left early for a job in a neighboring town, that sometimes men took off and didn't tell. The bar's regulars said the town just swallowed a man and kept moving. I went to the river and felt the hum like a bruise. People mourn in small towns by remembering the minute details that made a person human. Marcus's habit of chewing pencils, the dent in his driver's door, the way he hummed off-key when he fixed an engine. Those things kept him alive at the table long after he was gone. But ritual likes numbers, not tenderness. It had accepted a trade, and the ledger balanced. There are those who will read this and call it superstition or grief talking. They'd be right to suspect both. But grief is a kind of truth-teller, blunt and often unfair, and superstition is a tool people use to shape the random into patterns. I learned that our pattern had been older than any of us, a rumor passed like a family recipe. Elliot Franks had been the first anchor, a man who noticed a rhythm and tried to hold it in a town that would have preferred to forget. Someone had answered him in the dark, and then the town answered back by being able to sleep at night. In the year since, I have become the only man in town who keeps a small drawer full of broken watch parts. I call them my talismans, which sounds ridiculous and a little theatrical and not at all like the mechanic's drawer it is. Hannah moves away in the spring, taking a pie tin and her small, stubborn courage. Liza still arranges flowers on East Main, but now leaves a single white daisy out front on certain nights. Silas winds his clocks religiously and tells me, once in a while, that he hears the river whisper his name in the hours when clocks are most honest. I tell this story because somebody asked me to on a cold November night when the leaves were all saying goodbye. People like endings, and this one does not offer an easy one. If you want to hear the tidy version, the one that comforts, you can say I saved the town by smashing a watch. If you want the firmer bone, the part that sits under your rib when you try to laugh about it, I made a bargain, and the bargain asked for something. The truth I carry is the small, sharp thing of memory. I did what I could. Marcus is still a seat at the bar in my mind. Hannah's pies are a ghost in the market. The watches stop showing up, but every so often, when the river is the color of old coins and the streetlights blink like a tired eyelid, I feel counted. I count back because counting is the only conversation I know how to hold with whatever keeps score. If you ever find yourself in Benton Harbor on a night when the fog sits low and the river sounds like a clock, walk past the tannery and listen. Don't be clever about it. Don't look for monsters or men. Just listen. You might hear the town keeping time. You might hear, if you pay attention, a voice reading the ledger out loud. And if you hear someone call your name in a voice that sounds like someone reading the day's mail, don't treat it like a joke. Pick a direction and keep walking. That's what I did. That's what kept me breathing long enough to tell you this. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jacob Halloway. I was 32 on October 13, 2018. You want a true tale, you say? Then let me pull back the curtains for you slow, like someone showing you the grooves in an old photograph. This is not the kind of story that begins with a bang. It begins with small things, the way the river smells in the fall, that thin metallic tang that the news anchors never notice, the stubborn charm of a town that has been bruised but keeps opening its doors. Benton Harbor looked kind of forgotten in places. Brick facades with paint peeled into honest maps, porches rhymed with the dust of seasons, and a downtown clock that ran 5 minutes slow so people could be late and still feel on time. I'll introduce the people because you'll need names to hang the fear on. There was me, Jacob Halloway, restless more than brave. My neighbor, a man named Victor Lyle, who ran a tiny mechanic shop off Willard Street and kept his coffee in a thermos the size of a small can. He could fix engines and the small awkward silences that settle between neighbors. There was Rosie Calhoun, who owned the bakery with cinnamon rolls that smelled like a parenting book. She was the type of person who remembered every detail about everyone's childhood, even the parts they'd rather forget. And there was Officer Mark Denby, a man who wore the precinct's fatigue like a second skin and who believed rules were more than ink on paper. I knew the rhythms of the town. Weekday mornings were a steady parade of workers and school kids. Evenings softened into the long, quiet pauses that belong to places where everyone knows your business. On certain nights, the riverfront would empty into a hush so thick you could feel it in your teeth. Tourists came in small bursts during the summer, but left by Labor Day, and the town retreated into itself like a tide pulling back to reveal secrets on the riverbed. Before the thing happened, before that night I still replay in too vivid color, there were a bunch of ordinary pressures that had nothing to do with terror, but everything to do with how my life was arranged to receive it. My hours at the factory were crooked. Overtime came in clutch, and then vanished. I'd been saving, my apartment plastered with lists and receipts, a slow-bleeding attempt at a new life, somewhere I hadn't learned the shortcuts yet. I'd been having bad dreams about being late for a train that never arrived. Little grotesque things people ignore until they can't. The town had its superstitions. Old men at the diner would tell you about the black tide. Not a literal tide, but a mood that could roll across the river and lay heavy hands on the town's nerves. Teenagers dared each other to stand on the old pier and shout into the dark water because the water would echo back wrong, and the echoes became a private currency for people who wanted to call something out and then pretend they never heard the reply. There were stories about the warehouses, places with boarded windows and a history of people doing desperate things. Kids painted graffiti that looked like warnings, not art. Jagged letters and numbers that meant nothing until someone thought about them too long. I'm telling you this because a setting is more than geography. It's taste, rumor, weather, the way streetlights bath the sidewalks in jaundiced halos. It's why a town like Benton Harbor can feel like a friendly place and like a place waiting to tell you what it knows about you. People in the town were not oblivious. We were just practiced in pretending we were. Victor had a dog, a big brindle mutt named Atlas, who preferred the shadows of the shop over the fluorescent lights. Rosie's oven clock was always a minute too fast. She insisted it kept her honest. Mark, the officer, could be counted on to show up at the community meetings with a soft preparedness, a man who would rather use his presence to signal calm than to flex authority. These small certainties were my anchors. They taught me where to go when the night felt like it might fold in on itself. I had reasons to be out that night. A sheet of overtime, a check that would finally cover the repair for my car. I drove slow through the main drag before the clouds fully rolled in, slow enough to see the old neon signs and the way rain made them tremble. The October air felt like change, the kind of change that's more an idea than a step. I stopped by Rosie's to pick up a wrapped loaf, comfort and sugar to counterbalance the plainness of a long shift, and she asked me about a flyer she'd seen about a neighborhood watch meeting. I said I'd consider it. Consideration was all things were being handed in those days until one decision weighed more than the others. People in small towns keep their alarms quiet. We tell ourselves we know what's happening because we've learned how to name our fears. There was talk a week or two before about odd things. Cars parked with their engines off near the river past midnight. Faces at the edge of streetlight pools that disappeared when you turned the corner. Nobody called the paper because nothing had been stolen and the calls would sound petty and bourgeois. The police would joke about kids testing courage, but the jokes always carry the echo of something real. So that's the lead-in. The town, the faces, the weather, the small tensions, the bakery's warmth, the mechanic's radio, the river's slow gossip. It was a night that smelled like copper and rain, and I had a loaf of bread wrapped in the paper Rosie used. I had the kind of unease that is not yet a story, but will, in time, knit itself into one. I had the lights on my dashboard that blinked low on gas and high on everything else. I had the unremarkable habits that make people traceable, the route I took, the places I liked to stop, the friends who knew to expect me home by a certain hour. After 700 words of knots and threads, people and places and small reliances, the main thing happened. The main thing that I will always remember with the clarity of fresh cuts, the part where the ordinary broke open and let the town's quieter, harder truths pour through. The first sound was not what you expect. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was a metallic tap, a careful counting, like someone trying to keep score in a game where the rules had gone missing. My headlights picked out a figure at the river's edge, half swallowed by shadow. I should have driven on. I should have kept the heater on and the radio playing and the world wrapped in the small lit box of my cab. But the thing about being 32 and restless is you tell yourself you can fix other people's misfortunes with small gestures. So I parked, more inches than pride, and got out. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I kept my hands in my pockets like I always did when I was trying to look casual and not terrified. The tapping came again, deliberate, patient, like someone counting out the beats of a song they'd rehearsed 1,000 nights. Up close, the sound was coming from something small and metal, maybe a can or a pipe, but I couldn't tell. The light from my phone made everything look cheap and washed out. "Hey," I said, and my voice sounded too loud in the dark. The figure at the water's edge turned its head. There was a face under a hood, pale as the underside of river fog, and two eyes that caught my light like coins. For a moment I thought I knew the face, the jawline, the way the person tilted their head, but the shadows rearranged features faster than memory could keep up. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, because that felt like the right thing. People say the wrong thing when they're trying to thread themselves out of a mess. The river answered with a soft, wet hiss. The figure's hand dropped. The metal tapping stopped. Silence snapped down on the scene so fast I felt like I'd stepped into a sealed room. I should have turned and walked back to the car. I should have turned the key and driven home and put the loaf of Rosie's bread on the counter and pretended the night had never leaned towards something that looked like malice. But I did something else. I took a half step forward. "Are you?" I started. The thing at the water's rim didn't answer. Instead, it took 3 slow steps backward, exactly the same distance those teenagers would shout into the pier and wait for the wrong echo. It was as if the shadow wanted me to follow. The river smelled stronger up close, iron and old leaves, a copper memory of something that had happened there long before I was born. I took another step. My foot sank in mud and I cursed under my breath. The figure's shoulders moved like a person shrugging off an expectation. "You lost?" came a voice, thin and dry, that could have belonged to anyone at the edge of town, a fisherman, a clerk at the corner store, and yet the tone suggested it knew my name without needing to find it. "Jacob," I answered. Saying my name out loud anchored me. "You lost too?" The person laughed then, a quick, small sound that had no warmth. "No," they said. "I'm keeping count." Keeping count of what? I thought of the graffiti numbers I'd seen on the warehouse wall, the jagged black paint like a chorus of warnings. 33, 13, 7. My brain betrayed me and tried to knit those digits into a sentence. The figure moved again, closer to me now, and I could finally see they were young, younger than me, maybe mid-20s. Not a face I recognized, but familiar enough that my stomach tightened. There was something about the way their fingers curled around that small metal thing, a ritual in miniature. "You calling the cops?" I asked, thinking of Mark Denby and how he took things personally. The figure shook its head. "No cops, no lights, just numbers." The metal tapped once against the palm of their hand. 1. I laughed at that. A hollow reflex. 1, 2. The hand tapped again. The sound came from everywhere. It was no longer just the figure. Something had started tapping deeper in the dark, somewhere behind the line of warehouses. It echoed off corrugated steel, answered from the river, winked back from the underside of the pier. My mouth went dry. The simple tick-tick-tick-tap had become a chorus, a slow metronome for something set to begin. "Look, I don't know what game," I started, and the figure held up a hand. There was a glint of wetness on the knuckles, like fresh river spray. "You shouldn't come here," they said. "This is where things get added." The words were matter-of-fact, as if they'd recited them 1,000 times. "Added to what?" I demanded, more affronted than brave. "To a list?" The young person smiled then, but it was a small, practiced thing that didn't fit the eyes. "Numbers," they said. "We add numbers. We keep score." They tapped again. 3. I took a step back, then another. The town felt farther away with every inch. My phone vibrated in my pocket with an incoming call. Victor. I felt a clay weight settle somewhere behind my ribs. I let it ring out. If I answered, that would be a confession that I was not fine. If I didn't, that would be another layer of denial. "Why me?" I heard myself ask. The question was stupid, because I'd learned, in ways I hadn't chosen, that anybody could be the answer to that question in small towns like ours. But the figure tilted their head in such a way that it suddenly looked like an answer waiting to be written on the air. "You weren't me," they said simply. "Not before. Not tonight." Their tapping sped up. 4, 5. A shadow peeled itself from behind the warehouse, another silhouette, then another, a line of people like marionettes stepping into movement. They came from places that should have been empty, from the boarded lot, from the weeds where kids used to play. Their faces were strangers and echoes of known faces alike. I could have sworn for a flash that one of them had Victor's posture, Rosie's steady hands folded across her chest, but the light lied, and memory plays tricks in the dark. The line made a shallow ring around me. The tapping became a shape, a presence. It matched the pulse of my own blood, and for a moment I thought the town itself had decided to raise a hand against me. "You have to let me go," I said, and the words came out too fast. I've got. The sentence collapsed because what did I have? Bread, a car with a sputtering gaslight, a list of numbers in a notebook. I've got people who will notice if I'm late, I added, because the idea of Rosie worrying about a cold loaf seemed like a last tether to normal. One of them stepped close, and for the first time I smelled something like perfume, a sharp, domestic scent that contradicted the river and the mud. We notice, the person said, but noticing is counting too. Their hand reached towards me, not grabbing so much as touching like a confirming press. It felt cold, like metal. Panic said run. Sense said, don't make a scene. The circle tightened. I felt something, my shoe snagging on an old rope, a hand on my shoulder that might be practiced in restraint. My heart skidded against my ribs as the tapping started to climb, clicking faster, the numbers counting off like the pages of a ledger flipped with a hurried finger. I shoved. I moved. For a breath, for a scalded second, the world became motion. My car keys in my fist, the taste of metal and the river, the slap of mud on my jeans. I heard a shout, a real human shout, familiar. Jacob! Light flared from the street behind them. Mark Denby's cruiser cut through the dark like a blade of authority, finally awake, siren muted but lights throwing hard blue across wet pavement. The circle dissolved in a confusion of movement and shadow. Bodies slipped back into places where people were supposed to be. The tapping slowed, clumsy as a child startled into silence. Someone grabbed my arm, Mark, strong and practical. Rosie was there too, hair tucked under her coat, breath forming small clouds. Victor loomed at her shoulder, Atlas whining in the dim. For a frantic second, I felt every anchor of the town press close around me like a safety net. But the figure at the river's edge was gone. The place where they'd stood was only mud and the faint grooved print of bare feet leading into the black water. The tapping had vanished, cut off like a song mid-verse. You okay? Mark asked. His voice had that practical, flat edge it used when someone's world had snagged on something they couldn't explain. I tried to nod. My head hummed with the counting. 4, 5, 6. I couldn't stop hearing the numbers lingering in the air. By the time I climbed back into my car, Rosie was steadying me with the kind of hands that could stitch open a panic. Victor handed me a thermos of coffee as if that would solve anything. Mark watched, the officer who believed words like weird and report were tools we used to make sense of nights like this. I drove home with the heater on full and Rosie's loaf beside me, the windows fogging from the inside until the world outside blurred into indistinct light. Somewhere behind, the river carried its secrets downstream, and I kept feeling like a notch had been made where I used to be whole. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't hear the tapping again. But sometimes, when the town was quiet and my phone dark, I could hear a faint counting in the back of my skull. I told myself it was the after effect of adrenaline. I told myself I had imagined most of it. Those are the small lies people tell themselves to survive. But the numbers stayed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The nights after that first riverside counting spun out like days inside a bell. People kept showing up to my doorstep in the daytime with questions that hid their fear. Rosie brought me soup that tasted like safety and cinnamon. Victor gave me tools and tried to fix whatever had been bent inside me. Mark came by with the kind of small talk cops use to anchor unstable things. You sure you don't want us to file anything? And I kept telling them the truth in the way people do when the truth is too heavy. I don't know what to file. I did the thing I should have done sooner. I started asking questions out loud. Not the quiet kind that whispers to yourself before sleep, but the jangling kind that gets answers. I pulled the Bent County missing persons lists, public records, thin and bureaucratic, and cross-referenced them with local obituaries with the graffiti numbers I'd seen on the warehouse wall, with tips that smelled like rumor. I built a grid in the back room of my apartment. Names, dates, places last seen, little X's where the river ran near. I slept on the couch and scrawled with a marker until my hand cramped. The tally grew into a pattern. The numbers weren't random at all. They appeared in the margins of accident reports, scratched into benches, whispered in the mouths of teenagers who told them like jokes. 33, 13, 7. Small numbers that kept cropping up next to names that had slipped off the town's daily list. People who went out for cigarettes and never came home. Cars found abandoned with doors open like yawns. A woman who'd gone to the pier and vanished while her husband dialed 911 with steady hands. Each notch matched a disappearance, and the disappearances started to cluster around the water as if the river had learned where we stored our weaknesses. I took the list to Rosie. I watched her thumb the names like a reader trying to find a paragraph she recognized. Her face folded slow and then set hard. Victor came in with Atlas wagging and a dust-smudged look like he'd been worried all along but didn't want to say it. Mark brought the official tone and then let it go because there is a limit to paperwork when the town itself is making a claim. "We're not the first to notice," Rosie said quietly, and that line carried weight. "There were stories, Jacob. Before you, before me, before the bakery opened. Old men calling the river a ledger. My grandmother used to say the water keeps a list of what we owe. Old superstitions dressed as language is how things with teeth start. We went back to the river at midday and looked for signs. There was a new ring of nailed boards on the pier, splintered and more recent than the rest, and beneath them, tucked and secret, a small wooden box like a child's keepsake chest. Inside were the usual things people leave when they mean it: a folded photograph, a rusted charm bracelet, a grocery list with a name written across the margin. Underneath that detritus, almost like a ledger, were tiny slash marks and numbers, careful, neat tallying in pencil. "That's what they were doing," Victor said, and his voice had that familiar notch that told me he'd lost someone once and kept it in the jaw's shadow. "Counting." The town met that night, in a crowded gym where the fluorescent lights made everyone look cruelly honest. People came with candles and knuckles of worry. We debated, we traded theories, and like a slow-rolling storm, we decided to stand watch the next night. Not because we thought it would stop anything remarkable, but because sometimes solidarity alone can rattle the edges of fear into something manageable. We chose a line of people to sit along the riverbank, heads turned like watchers at an old play. Rosie and Victor and Mark were there, and a handful of neighbors whose faces had previously been just bricks in the town's ordinary wall. Midnight smelled of algae and distant engines. We wore coats and the stubbornly false confidence of people who have done bedtime stories and called them closure. At 12:23 a.m., the tapping began again. It was thinner this time, faster, a nervous staccato rising from the south bank. From the shadow, a figure emerged, the young person I'd first seen, and they weren't alone. Others came with them, faces pulled tight with an intent that was almost ceremonial. They moved like people reading from memory. They didn't try to hide. We confronted them, a group of ordinary citizens with flashlights and the blunt authority of moral outrage. The circle parted with the deliberateness of a ritual interrupted. The leader, the young person, did not seem surprised to see us. There was a steadiness in them, like someone who had rehearsed being brave for a long time. "You can't do this," Mark said, his voice the thin rope between law and panic. You can't keep." "We're not doing anything," the young person replied. Their voice had a weary patience, like someone tired of explaining math to a child. "We're keeping tally." The question wasn't the kind that answers easily. We asked who they were and why they counted, and whether the counting took anyone. The answer came out not as an apology, but as a confession of a town's grief, dressed into an operating manual. Years ago, they said there had been an agreement, the kind towns make when resources run thin and fear turns practical. People promised to remember their losses in a visible way, to tally them so the river would know the debt of lives owed. The counting started as mourning and grew into something else, a ritual they thought might trade back bodies for balance. It didn't work the way they wanted. The counting became aimless, hungrier. Names were added and added until the tally wanted a keeper. "You can stop," Rosie said. "This isn't." They shook their head. Stopping would be adding more. The river needs the list. It takes the ones left out. That was not an answer that satisfied law or logic. It was an answer born of a logic older than us, a bargaining with a world that runs by its own rules. I stepped forward then with the list I'd made in my apartment and laid it on the wet wood between us. "Names," I said. "You're using names to bargain." "We aren't bargaining," the young person said. "We're obeying. There's a shape to how debts are settled." When they spoke, their fingers tapped reflexively against something small in their pocket. the same thin metallic sound that had been the first note of my nightmare. I realized, with a coldness that made my thinking slow, that the leader wasn't simply a perpetrator. They were a prisoner. The ritual had turned on its creators the way a machine can outgrow its maker. They kept the count because it promised meaning. In return, it wanted continuity, and it would take what it needed to keep the math true. We argued, we shouted, we tried to make laws and cries and promises stretch to hold the enormity of the need there on the bank. In the end, there was no neat solution. No official who could file a form to stop a river from choosing. No judge who could rule against what the tide preferred. What we did instead was imperfect and human. We offered a different ledger. We began to collect the names of those still here and to speak them aloud every night at the river, as if speaking could be a kind of substitution. We gathered photographs and voices and recipes and read them to the water. It felt ridiculous and holy, a poem of defiance. We invited the people who counted to join us, to let the act of remembering be shared rather than kept as some private tax. The young person watched and then, slowly, joined. The tapping slowed, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like the river listened instead of only taking. Maybe the river wasn't a ledger at all, but a bell. If we toll it in a certain way, it rings differently. I never stopped hearing the numbers. They settle sometimes at the edge of sleep like a leftover chorus. But something changed. The disappearances didn't magically stop. The world is never so obliging, but people who used to keep the count alone now had company. The town learned to talk about debts without worshiping them. We learned to hold names like flares rather than weights. Years later, I still pass the pier and see the little box tucked where it won't wash away, and I lay a folded paper there and whisper a name. It's the work of neighbors now, not of a single tally. Rosie bakes an extra roll each morning for the person who forgets to eat. Victor keeps Atlas by his side and fixes more than cars. He keeps an eye on the river, Slive, too. Mark sometimes comes down just to listen when the night grows taut. The truth of the thing, whether the river ever had an appetite and whether we satisfied it or merely distracted it, is less important to me than the thing we did in response. People talked. We compiled lists of what mattered, and instead of letting accounting become a god, we made it a ritual of remembering that included everybody. The town is scarred. Those scars are like maps. But scars also make a place legible. You learn where the cliffs are and you walk careful. If there is a moral, if this is the sort of story that earns one, it's that towns will build strange economies for their grief if left to themselves. But when enough people gather and refuse to carry the weight alone, rituals can unlearn their old hunger. Sometimes, when the wind comes off the river, I still hear a metallic tap. I turn and look, and in the dark I see a figure half hidden by hood and shadow. Sometimes it is a child with a bottle. Sometimes it is an old woman counting rosary beads. Sometimes it is the young person with their fingers in their pocket. We nod and we add a name to the box, and we keep watch, not because we believe we can buy what's been lost, but because we will not let the town count alone. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 32 at the time. The night everything broke loose was October 13th, 2018. If you've never been to Benton Harbor, Michigan, picture a small city that sits stubbornly on the edge of Lake Michigan, a place where the wind launches itself off the water and the streetlights hum a little louder than they should. It's a town full of old brick storefronts and churches with cracked steeples, where everyone knows someone who knows someone, and secrets live in basements and behind closed blinds. People there laugh at the cold the way they laugh at bad jokes, because what else are you going to do? I moved to Benton Harbor after a string of bad jobs and worse relationships. I needed cheap rent and an easy place to disappear for a while, so I took a second-floor room in a duplex on a street the locals called Willow Bend. The house had been built by hands that remembered sweat, not contractors, with laptops. The floorboards creaked like they were still settling into sins. My landlord, a woman named Joan Whitfield, was the kind of neighbor who baked and stared and asked questions that felt like they belonged in a different century. Joan told me the house had a history. She said it like she was warning me and blessing me at once. I worked nights at a small printing shop near the harbor, and the job suited someone who liked his own company. I liked fonts more than people. I had a cheap truck, a dog named Gus that wasn't really mine, but liked me when I had spare sandwich crusts, and a habit of walking late at night to clear my head. It was the late walks that made me feel like I was finally learning the city, learning the echoes on its empty streets, the way distant propane heaters sounded like conversations, the way the river at the edge of town carried secrets to the lake and gave none back. You meet characters in towns like this without trying. There was Ray, who ran the bait shop and had a laugh like a busted piano. Lila, who worked the diner and carried a cigarette like it was an argument she intended to win. And Father Donnelly, who prayed like someone who'd been ignored often enough to get creative. I liked Lila best. She taught me how to order coffee in a voice that made baristas think you were a regular. But the person who mattered, the one who would occupy my nights forever after, was a kid named Eli Turner. Eli was 19, a skinny thing with hollow cheeks and a skateboard that had seen better days. He was the kind of kid who looked like he was listening to a song only he could hear. He lived a few streets over in a boarding house that smelled of old books and lemon oil. I started noticing him because he'd be out late on his skateboard, always near the river walk, eyes fixed on the water like he could weigh its moods. One night he slipped, and I helped him up. He told me he worked odd jobs and cleaned the riverbank sometimes. He had a small smile, like he'd swallowed something sad and decided to keep it. There was something about Eli that made me protective without asking permission. Maybe because he was young, or maybe because Benton Harbor had a way of chewing people up and spitting out the ones it decided not to carry. He told me about a house down by the old foundry, an abandoned 3-story brick thing with boarded windows and playground ghosts that kids dared each other to enter. They called it the Hathaway Place. It had belonged, a neighbor told me, to a family that had moved away decades ago and left more than furniture behind. Joan never said much about it, except once when she closed the curtains like someone closing a stubborn wound. She muttered, "No good ever sits idle in places like that." For months after that, the Hathaway house was just one more collapsed thing on the edge of town. We all knew the outline. Sagging porch, the buzz of insects inside like a second skyline, a swing that hung at an angle like a guilty finger. Kids whispered about shapes in the attic and footsteps when the wind was still. I put it out of my mind until the night Eli vanished. I remember the date clear as a cut glass, October 13, 2018. The air had that brittle feel where every sound catches your breath. I had stayed late at the shop fixing a fussy press. Gus had slept at my feet. By habit, I went for my late walk after closing. I walked the river because that night the river looked like an honest thing, black and unbothered, reflecting the sky's indifferent stars. I saw Eli near the Hathaway house for the last time, crouched by the gate with a flashlight, running his hand along the old iron like he was trying to read it. He waved me over. He had a small grin, the kind that asked for a dare. "You want to see something?" he said, voice low. I should have said no. I should have kept walking, but curiosity is a persistent animal, and this town feeds it well. We climbed the porch steps and pushed the rotted gate. The front door opened with a noise like a complaint. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and something sweeter, like a scent memory. Rose water, old perfume, the kind of thing that means someone used to care about how the place looked. The beam of Eli's flashlight cut through dust motes that hung in the air like snow gone soft. The foyer held a tall staircase that groaned under our weight as if offended by movement. On the wall, a portrait, faded and stern, watched us approach. We moved through rooms that had been abandoned at the height of a life, a child's mantle, a tea set with cups that had lost their handles, a piano with half keys like missing teeth. The house felt like a mouth. Eli slipped his hand into a doorway and came out with a small tin box. He opened it like someone revealing a secret. Inside were letters wrapped in a ribbon the color of dried blood, and a photograph of a family whose eyes looked hollow as windows. I don't know when the house stopped being a house and started being a set piece for something else. It was subtle at first. The air grew colder, not the kind of cold that your coat can fix, but the kind that comes from being watched. The house settled again, and then it sounded like it was clearing its throat. The floor above us creaked slowly, step by deliberate step, like a countdown. Eli laughed, a thin sound that didn't reach his eyes. He said we'd better go, but not in the way you say, "let's go," in the way people say it when they are trying to convince themselves of safety. That laugh is where the main story begins, if you're keeping time by the heart. It is where something in the house noticed us back and decided that we were guests who overstayed our welcome. It is where the thing that had been lying patient as a tooth in the dark woke up and remembered it liked company. The porch behind us that had been firm became unreliable. The gate that had opened without effort now squealed like an animal. We were not alone. The house had been waiting, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, it picked us. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The house decided to move its pieces like a player arranging pawns. The staircase behind us sighed as if irritated, and then, without warning, the sound of weight above, heavy, deliberate, stepped across the landing. Eli's flashlight jittered in his hand. He swallowed, and for a moment he looked younger than 19. "We should go," he said again, voice gone thin. We turned back to the foyer, and the front door, which had been ajar when we came in, was now shut. Not closed in the way a wind closes a door. It was locked by habit, by something with memory. I grabbed the knob, and it resisted like a cold hand. The lock held. The house had us on its own time. "Maybe it's," Eli began, but whatever he was about to say was swallowed by a sound I hadn't been prepared for. Something scratching from within the walls, like nails running along ribs. It traveled, a slow scrape that moved through the house like a tide. The portrait on the wall, the Stern family, seemed to look more alive than any picture should. The painted eyes caught the flashlight beam and glinted as if aware. We tried the back stairs. They complained and then gave us a cold gust of air carrying cigarette smoke and an old perfume note that made my stomach twist. The rooms blurred. Wallpaper peeled like curling skin. There were handprints in dust where no hand could have been. We called out. Our voices did nothing but bounce and shrink into the house's vast throat. Eli took a step toward the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. He said something about the cellar. He thought he'd seen a light there earlier, or heard someone moving boxes. I didn't like the idea of a light below. Basements in places like this are where the house keeps its private things. But Eli went anyway, like a moth that can't stop testing the edge of a flame. Halfway down the hall, he froze. The beam from his flashlight wavered, then dove down like gravity pulled it. From somewhere beyond, a sound answered us. A child's humming, high and sweet, the kind that gets under your skin. The humming didn't fit the house. It fit something that hadn't been buried properly. "Eli?" I said. He didn't answer. I saw the way his shoulders tightened and then dropped. His skateboard lay against the banister, its wheels still with the grit of the river walk. That moment where I understood the shape of danger was small and fast. The skateboard was there, but Eli wasn't. I called his name again, louder, but the house ate it. I ran the hallway and found in the living room where the piano sat like a ruined altar, the tin box. It lay open on the floor, letters spilling like pale tongues. The photograph had been torn in two. One half showed the family, mother, father, 2 kids with hollow eyes, and the other half was missing. The ribbon lay strewn, a brown, brittle loop that might have once held everything together. I could feel the house watching my hands. I sprinted toward the back staircase, toward the cellar door. The steps to the basement were crooked, and as I descended, the smell got worse. Damp and rot, but also something metallic, like pennies burned. A small light flickered ahead, bluish, like moonlight through a dirty window, but the cellar windows were boarded. The light didn't belong to any lamps I recognized. It hovered over a stack of boxes, and for a second, I thought I saw movement, something small and fast. "Eli!" I shouted, and this time the sound came back to me garbled as if threaded through a radio underwater. A laugh answered, a child's laugh, then the scraping again, and then a whisper behind me that said a name I didn't know. I spun, and in the pale light, the boxes that had been orderly moments before were scattered, as if yesterday's efforts had been erased and rewritten by invisible hands. There was a door at the back of the cellar, a short, cramped thing, painted the kind of green that people in previous eras thought calming. It was ajar, and through it I saw a narrow stair, climbing up, not to the main house, but to a space within the walls, a crawl space big enough to hold a person curled up like a secret. From inside came the faintest scrape of a shoe, and then, clear and small as a coin dropped on wood, the sound of someone breathing. I eased the door open. A draft came out that smelled of river mud and the iron tang of old sea salt. Something moved in the crawl space, an arm, then a shoulder, then the sliver of a face I knew. Eli's jaw, dust streaking his cheek, eyes wide and darker than I had ever seen. He looked at me like he had seen something that had nothing to do with me, and then he smiled. A crooked, very small smile that didn't reach those eyes. "Marcus," he whispered. He said my name like it was an accusation or a spell. "You shouldn't have brought anyone else." Before I could grab him, the light in the crawl space went out, as if someone had taken the room's breath away. The air tightened. I felt fingers, not fingers, but the prickle you feel when something invisible runs along the back of your neck. I lunged with hands that barely remembered being steady and caught only fabric. Eli slipped. He wasn't pulled so much as he left, like water sliding off skin. I saw the inside of the wall close over the space he had been occupying, the seam smoothing like a healed cut. There was no scream. There was only the small, final clack of a child's skateboard wheel as it rolled from the banister to the floor and stopped at my feet. For a moment the house hummed, satisfied, then settled into a silence full of applause. I grabbed the skateboard and held it like evidence, like a last chance to prove something happened. I tried to pry the wall open with my hands and then with the heel of my boot. The plaster resisted like a living membrane. My palms bled. I tasted iron. The room above me was suddenly full of the sound of someone walking the upstairs in heavy boots. 3 steps, pause, 3 more steps, then nothing. The house had rearranged itself. The cellar door, the crawl space, the path that had let me see Eli. All of it looked ordinary again, as if nothing had been disturbed. I rose on shaking legs and ran for the door. I crashed through the foyer and found the front door open, wide as if it had never been closed, and the night air poured in like guilty light. The street outside smelled like frying oil and the lake. The city was asleep on its small, honest blocks and didn't know that we had been chosen. I carried Eli's skateboard to Joan's house. She took one look at me, at the blood on my knuckles, at the state of my clothes, and called Lila from the diner like she was calling a priest. Father Donnelly arrived with a rosary in his pocket and the kind of hope that hadn't been tested much lately. Ray came with a flashlight that shivered and a baseball cap pulled down like a helmet. We went back to the Hathaway place together the next day. The police came because you go to them when a person disappears. They found nothing but old dust, letters, and a half-eaten sandwich in a pantry that should have been empty. They took statements and offered condolence with the practiced calm of people who have seen too many strange things. They didn't find Eli. They chalked it up to a runaway, to a bad decision, to the kind of youthful recklessness Benton Harbor, like any town, has its share of. But I found things the officers missed. In the attic, hidden behind a trunk, I found a child's notebook with the edges chewed off. On the inside cover, someone, maybe the family, maybe a kid who had once breathed in that house, had written in a careful looping hand, "Do not let the house eat the names." The ink ran in a place where it should not have. Underneath, new and shaking, were scrawls that looked like someone had been writing as the house listened. "Ela, watch the river. Do not answer. Keep running." And then a fresh line, written with a hand that could only have been mine if I had ever written such a thing. "Marcus, don't go alone." I left the attic with the notebook clutched to my chest, and the house looked at me with all the calm of someone who has witnessed hunger and is untroubled by remorse. I carried the skateboard to the river and set it on the bank where the water could see it. Gus danced around my feet as if he had been waiting for something to be decided. I should have walked away. I should have let the city sleep and let Eli be his own secret. Instead, in the way men tie themselves to mistakes, I promised out loud I would find him. I didn't say I could do it or that I would be safe. I said, "I'll find you," because saying it felt like an oath, and oaths have a way of holding people in terrible, necessary places. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The town started to murmur after that. People who'd shrugged when Eli disappeared now glanced at their door frames like they might find teeth there. Someone remembered a boy who'd vanished in '92. Someone else, a woman who walked into the market and never left the line. Names that had been easy to forget until you stopped and tried to say them out loud and felt the sound falter. Father Donnelly kept a list in his drawer, folded into the brown Bible like a secret the church dared not speak of in the sermon. Joan brought casseroles in silence. Lila pressed coffee into my hands and looked at me like she knew guilt when it came gifting a person. The police stamped papers and suggested the most ordinary tragedies, runaways, bad choices, things that fit their forms. But in the quiet corners of the diner and in the way the river carried sound, the truth didn't fit any form people knew. I couldn't stand the thought of somebody else's life being reduced to a box, checked by an officer who'd never felt a house watching him. I started small. I followed footprints, talked to kids who skimmed along the river at night, listened to what the wind had decided to keep. It didn't take long to find patterns. Those taken had been where the house could see them when it wanted to see. They'd lingered by thresholds. They'd answered a knock that wasn't there. There was a rhythm to the vanishings, and the Hathaway house sat at the heart of it, like a throat, with a taste for certain names. The notebook I had found in the attic never left my jacket. The words inside chased me. Do not let the house eat the names. It was simplicity itself, and yet a warning like that can be a kind of tool. If the house collected names, maybe names could be used to bargain. Maybe names were its coin. I started to look for where a house might hide names. Old houses have attics and trunks and basements, but they also have skin, wallpaper, beams, plaster. You'd be surprised what a house will hide behind its tongue. The tin box had been a signpost. The photograph, torn in two, had been a tally. I went back to the Hathaway place every night for a week, watching from across the street like someone waiting for a bus that may never come. At night, the windows looked like black teeth. Sometimes a light would glimmer, like a candle blown through a jar, and once I swore I saw a silhouette like somebody writing. On the 8th night, I went in alone. I could have called Ray or Father Donnelly, but the house didn't like witnesses. It preferred offers made directly. You talk to certain things alone the same way you talk in a confession, plainly, with the small honesty you think might hold up under pressure. The porch gave under my weight but didn't complain. The foyer smelled the way it had the first night. Old perfume, river rot, the cold iron tang of a thing that kept secrets like coins. I carried the notebook and Eli's skateboard. I carried a pen. I had decided that if names were its currency, my pen would be my sword. I found the attic door and climbed until my shoes squealed. The attic was a cathedral of smell and dust, but at the very back, behind crates of doll parts and an old trunk, a strip of wallpaper looked newer than the rest. I peeled it away because that's what desperate people do. They start pulling at seams. The wall beneath was shallow, and when I knocked, instead of the dull thud of empty studs, I heard something soft, like paper rubbing against paper. Behind the panel, there it was, a ledger. It was a book the size of a Bible, bound in cracked leather. Names were written on its pages in layers, in hands that ranged from precise schoolteacher loops to frantic scrawls. Some were dates and addresses. Some were drawings, childish and precise, sketches of rivers and swings and a small skateboard with scuffs. The names were arranged in columns, and the ink seemed to shift when I looked away, as if the book breathed. I placed the notebook beside the ledger and opened it. The attic light, which had been a weak halo, steadied. The ledger didn't belong to any furnishings. It belonged to the house. It loved names the way some people love music. As I read, I understood. The house didn't steal bodies to keep them in jars. It stole names because names are how people anchor themselves to memory. Take a name, and the person becomes a story the house tells itself at night. There was a margin note in a child's hand. Write your name. Don't let them take it. My hand hovered over the ledger, and I felt the house lean forward like a creature smelling food. It occurred to me then that bargains would have rules. The house would not give back what it did not accept to hold. Maybe to remove a name, you had to offer a different one. I thought about walking away. I thought about leaving the ledger and letting it keep its friendly, terrible hoard. Instead, I did what I said I'd do on the riverbank. I acted on oath. I picked up the pen, and I wrote Eli's name in the margin of the ledger in the careful hand of a man who wasn't yet sure if ink could bind a thing back to life. A sound sighed across the attic like wind stealing breath. Then softer, a scratch like paper in a cello case. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the page where Eli's name was started to glow in a way that was not light I had seen before. The glow of memory remembered, something like a wind unrolled in the room. The ledger shuddered and a slip of paper fluttered out like a moth and drifted toward me. On it, in neat, childish letters, were the words, Eli Turner, found. I did not believe my eyes. I did not believe my heart. I hurried downstairs, ledger tucked under my arm, and there, sitting on the back steps as if he'd been there the whole time, was Eli. He looked like someone who'd been borrowed and returned, his cheeks thinner, his eyes deeper, like bruises under skin. But he was breathing, and he could blink. When he saw me, he smiled that same small smile and laughed, a wet, uncertain sound. "You idiot," he said. "Took you long enough." We did not speak for a long while. He couldn't tell me exactly where he'd been, only pieces. A corridor of names, the sound of writing, the feeling of being made small by every word I ever said about him. He said there was a part of the ledger where the house kept the ones it couldn't let go of, names written so many times they had edges. He had been one of those that looked like he'd been tied to a weather vane and left to face the storm. I asked what it took to free him. He looked at the ledger, then at me, and said, "It wanted more. It likes trade." He tapped the page where I'd written, "It likes to be remembered. It likes your promise. It likes a name to keep. You gave Eli a place to come back to. Don't ask how, just be grateful." I had hoped maybe I'd saved us both. I hadn't counted on bargains being granular. As we stepped out into the night, carrying the ledger between us, the house exhaled like an old man who'd been waiting for company and then decided he didn't want it after all. The next morning, the news ran photos, and the town called us miracle bringers. The police asked for statements and for the ledger. I refused. Trades with hungry houses are not something to be taken apart in an interrogation room. Eli stayed with Joan for a while. He ate like he was making up lost months. He called his mother, who, to her credit, came back to town with a face like a woman who had been given a ghost and had to make it real. He kept quiet about parts of the attic, about what he'd seen there. People like explanations they can hold. A runaway returns, a missing boy is home. The ledger stayed hidden in my closet under a sweater pile thick enough to make a house of its own. But some trades aren't full returns. There were nights when I'd wake with a gap in my memory, a ribbon of time unspooled like thread. I'd find myself humming a tune I didn't remember learning. Once, for an entire day, I couldn't recall my mother's laugh. Those were the moments the house took, not bodies, but pieces. It had an appetite that I couldn't seem to starve. We thought that was the end, that we'd put a cork in the river and the water would behave. But towns like Benton Harbor hold memory like a skin holds scars. New names would whisper. Children dared each other to touch the Hathaway porch. Sometimes when the wind came in from Lake Michigan and the light hit the windows just wrong, you'd see, for a second, a shape inside that looked like somebody writing. I learned to live with a ledger in my closet, with that small, dangerous book that hummed like a thing that wanted to be read aloud. I learned the shape of bargains. I learned that the town would not forget entirely, and that was the cruel grace of it. We remembered enough to warn, not enough to stop. I tell this now because I was asked, because if names are currency, then memory is the coin we spend. Keep them close. Say the names of people you love aloud, even when it hurts, because sometimes saying a name is the only shield you have. Eli moved north a year later. He worked on a fishing boat for a while. He got a job that kept him away from idle porches and dark attics. I stayed. Some nights I still walk the river and look at the Hathaway place. The ledger is heavy in my closet, and sometimes I take it out and read names that shouldn't be forgotten. Some of them are mine to hold now, by choice or by price. If there's a moral here, it's a rude one. Places remember what you won't. Houses are patient. They take their time. And there are bargains, small and terrible, that you can make only once. I'm a man who learned what it means to promise and what it costs to keep one. I have my scars. I can taste iron when I try to remember a particular summer. I can tell you that Eli is alive and that I am too, But I also can't tell you everything the ledger knows, and maybe that's for the best. If you ever find yourself near an old house that keeps its eyes on you, do the sensible thing. Walk away. But if you are like me and you can't, then at least say the names out loud before the light goes and the walls start to listen. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.